Good afternoon, Chair Wilson, Vice Chair Crosby, and members of the Economic Matters Committee. My name is Drake Smith, the legislative intern for Delegate Mike Rogers, District 32. I respectfully request a favorable report on House Bill 662. This bill is simply altering the requirements for the subject matter of continuing education courses for licensees issued an initial license by the State Real Estate Commission, and generally relating to continuing education courses for real estate brokers, salespersons, and associate brokers. Under current law, all real estate licensees are required to take 15 hours of continuing education every 2 years. Current continuing education courses cover some mandated topics, and certain licensees, like brokers and real estate team leaders, must take specific courses within the 15 hours. This legislation will not increase continuing education hours for new licensees, but will mandate a specific set of courses different than the courses taken by existing licensees. Specifically, the bill lays out several areas of instruction for new licensees, such as advertising requirements, handling of escrow funds, landlord and tenant law, contract writing, contingencies, and regional contract differences, and lastly, financing. So once again, I respectfully request a favorable report on House Bill 662. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Bill Castelli on behalf of the Maryland Realtors. And we're in support of this legislation. The idea behind the bill is to essentially create within that first licensing period in that continuing education requirement a set of courses that are going to be very practical courses for a new licensee. So new licensees take 60 hours of pre-licensing. They learn a lot about the law, real estate law, different principles within real estate, but they don't really get a look at the Maryland real estate contract. They don't get experience with Maryland real estate disclosures. They don't know what to do with an escrow check when it's given to them. So this would really seek to give kind of really practical information about financing and contracts. There are a lot of real estate companies who have mentorship programs, and this is seeking to provide at least a base level within that first those first 2 years, a base level of education to make them service their clients better. So, and we encourage a favorable report.
Which one is it, Bill?
Thumbs up, favorable.
All right. Seeing no questions, that concludes this hearing. Good job, young man. Next, we go to Delegate Howard, House Bill 1225.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. For the record, Delegate Howard, here for favorable report on HB 1225. This bill requires the family member of a disabled or deceased real estate broker to submit a death certificate or evidence of the disability to the State Real Estate Commission in order to carry on the business of the disabled or deceased individual. This is a highly complex and controversial bill. Basically, if somebody dies or becomes incapacitated, it allows the brokerage, and correct me if I'm wrong, it allows the agent to go in front of the Real Estate Commission, say they've died, they've moved along, they're incapacitated. They review it, and then they can assign it, as long as that other broker is in good standing, they can assign that brokerage to another individual.
Yep. Yes, so Bill Castelli, again, on behalf of the Maryland Realtors, we are strongly in favor of it. And this really seeks to address kind of a problem that doesn't arise very often, but when it does, it's a big problem because all the agents work under a broker's license. They do not have authority to do anything if they do not have a broker license that they're working under. And there are occasionally times where a broker leaves an office, maybe changes to another brokerage, or in a case that we had recently where they died, and because of family issues, there was never a death certificate or anything that the Real Estate Commission could verify. So this is just a release valve to say the owner of the company can appeal to the Real Estate Commission, give the Real Estate Commission enough flexibility and authority to say, okay, you've explained to us why you need to reappoint a new broker. You've given us a new broker who is in good standing, and you can switch out the broker rather than waiting for that real estate broker who's dead or to move on. to actually file all the paperwork. And that's the problem that exists right now. So this allows the company to initiate the process rather than waiting for that broker to initiate it.
Okay, we'll go to our one virtual. Oh, go ahead.
Just real quick.
Oh.
He's gonna-
Sorry, Delegate Aaron's.
I thought part of the impetus of this bill was that if a broker quits, just let's say I have Steve Aaron's Realty, I'm the broker of record, and I just quit and say I'm done. What happens with the agents then?
Well, so it would apply in a situation like that. Typically, what would happen is the broker would turn in their parking card and certif license and everything to the real estate commission, and there would be no problem. The company would just appoint a new broker. But if the broker doesn't actually initiate that, then the company's left in kind of a situation where they've got a broker of record who really isn't working there anymore. Their agents are still captured by that. I mean, the worst case scenario is, the agents end up having to go on inactive status because they're not really working under a licensed broker anymore. So it can create a lot of disruption. Virginia actually made a change to create that.
How does this bill handle that, or doesn't it?
So it handles it by saying, look, if that broker doesn't turn in there, they've left, they've moved on, they've passed away, that company can now appeal to the real estate commission.
If I'm the broker and I'm the company,
If you're the broker and the company owner, it doesn't really address that situation. So if there are other elements of the law that would allow in instances of a death, for example, if that person died.
I got most of that. I'm just worried about, this is like, I thought this bill had something in it to address that specific issue, which I was led to believe had happened somewhere.
Yeah.
But we can talk about that later. Maybe
Okay.
there's an amendment. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, we'll go to our virtual testimony. Kevin Waterman.
Hello. Thank you, members of the committee, for the chance to be here today. My name is Kevin Waterman. I'm an office manager and associate broker at Coldwell Banker Waterman Realty. We're a small real estate brokerage over on the Eastern Shore. Just wanted to voice my support for this bill. Obviously, Bill from Maryland Maryland Realtors has gone and laid out a lot of the hows and whys. I just want to emphasize that I think it's, even though my office is a more traditional broker, is the owner type business, so this doesn't apply to us, it still is a benefit for myself and the agents at my office, insofar as, while we hope this situation never comes up ever again, we know that it has in Maryland. And if any of my agents were involved in a transaction with an office, where the other side is an office that has this situation happens, it creates problems, not just for that office and for those agents, but also for my agents and our clients as well, that suddenly we have the other side of the transaction. Agent is in this indeterminate, ambiguous situation of, can they still act to represent their clients? Are we able to, if they can't, are we able to interact with them? There's a lot of uncertainty there. So this is a change would be good, not just for agents, but also for the public as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And seeing no questions, that concludes this bill hearing. Next, we'll go to Delegate Holmes, back to back. First, we got HB 909. And Delegate, if you want to bring up, I don't know if you have a panel or not, but there's two people from the Department of Labor.
Yes, I'm hopeful that they're over at
They're leaving you at the altar. I got you.
They're over at Finance.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. For the record, my name is Delegate Marvin Holmes, and I am first going to present to you HB 909. And this is a very simple piece of legislation where we are simply doing a sunset extension on the State Commission on Real Estate Appraisers, Appraisal Management Companies, and Home Inspectors. And the reason why this sunset extension is necessary is because there are reports that are due by this commission, and some of those reports are federally mandated. And if we don't do this sunset extension, then we could perhaps be outside of the federal mandated requirements. All this is it's a sunset extension, and I will entertain any questions, Mr. Chair.
Seeing no questions, that concludes this bill hearing. We'll now go to House Bill 669. Delegate Holmes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to take a minute for the new people that are in the General Assembly, when the Vice Chair sits as the chair, he is referred to as the chair, just as Speaker Pro Tem, when he sits as the chair sits as the Speaker Pro Tem is also referred to as Madam Speaker. Just wanted to bring that to everyone's attention, those who are new.
You should talk to the chair about that rule.
Let me think about it, no. Ladies and gentlemen, I bring before you now HB 669. And I sent to each of you, let me back up. My name is Delegate Marvin Holmes, here in reference to HB 669. I sent to each of you via email, I'm hopeful that you received it, information about this bill, HB 669. And HB 669 is basically attempting to get an additional type of experience for appraisers to get into the business. There are some scenarios where persons attempting to get into the appraisal business are having a very difficult time. And I can give you one example, very close to me. My youngest daughter has a bachelor's degree in architecture and a master's degree in engineering. She wanted to go into the appraisal business, could not find someone to supervise her to get into the appraisal business. And that is a problem that is nationwide, as well as in the state of Maryland. This bill before you is an attempt to circumvent some of those supervision hour requirements. And it is called PARA, which stands for the Practical Application of Real Estate Appraisal. Now, this PARA program began back last year, 2 years ago, I'm sorry, began 2 years ago. And it is a program that was began by the Appraisal Foundation. And the Appraisal Foundation, ladies and gentlemen, is a congressionally certified program where it oversees appraisals and appraisers in the entire country. This organization created and established this PARA program, again, because of the reasonings that I stated earlier about persons being able to get into the appraisal business. In the state of Maryland, of all the appraisers in the state of Maryland, 4% are of a minority. And we've all heard about some of the issues in terms of appraisals in Prince George's and all across the state. And what we're attempting to do here is to get other persons into the appraisal business. I do have an amendment. I'm not quite sure you all received the amendment. You did not? Okay. It doesn't really make that much of a difference, quite frankly. But if you look at the bill, let's take a look at the bill here very quickly. You'll see that what the bill does is the bill actually talks about circumventing some of the supervisory training with this PARA program, and that's on page 2. So the bill simply circumvents some of the actual supervised training with this PARA program. The amendment that you obviously do not have, the amendment is the same language that's on page 2, but it refers to a different type of license. In the appraisal business, there are 3 different types of licenses. You have the trainer, you have the real estate license, and you have the general license. Each of them require different hours of training. What you have before you is the PARA program for the first step of licensure, which is 1,000 hours, or you take the PARA program. The amendment that you don't have before you is basically the language is exactly the same, but it refers to the It refers to the 1,500 hours of requirements for these other two levels of appraisers, but it also has the exact same language that you see here on page 2. So the bill here allows this para-training program to circumvent the actual supervision of appraisers. And I think I've given you quite a bit of information, and I will take questions. Madam Chair.
Thank you, Delegate Holmes. Delegate Weigel.
Yes, good question. This program is actually certified by the Appraisal Foundation, which I indicated is a congressionally mandated, congressionally authorized group, and it is authorized by the Appraisal Foundation. It is there currently is going to be a online training program. The cost is about $5,000 per student. And because of the cost, the $5,000 per student, those funds are going, the way we're proposing this right now, those funds are not being required from the state at all. That's going to come from the Appraisal Foundation, the congressional mandated group. And the supervision, the training will be under the auspice of, we're getting universities involved in this.
Okay.
Right now, we're talking to University of Maryland Eastern Shore, we're talking to Morgan State, and we're talking to Bowie State University to get these programs under their wing to supervise the programs, the para program.
So is it a certificate program or a certain number of hours or?
Yes, yes. The certification after the para is something that is applied to in lieu of the 1,000 hours for the supervisory training. So yes, it is.
Okay.
And if I could add, the training in the para program mirrors very specifically the same type of criteria that you would go through with the one-on-one supervision. There's about 15 different types of scenarios that you have to go through for the one-on-one supervision. It's the calculations for the appraisal, the understanding of the value of these things. All of that is part of the para program. It mirrors very closely the one-on-one supervision.
Sounds like a good bill, but I always have to question the sponsor. Thank you, Marvin.
I truly understand, sir.
Thank you, Marvin.
Delegate Queen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question, Delegate, probably hopefully is easy. Okay, I think we're there now. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a quick question. The testimony, and they may talk about it later, you have the Appraiser Institute and Department of Labor said favorable with amendments. Is the amendments you mentioned their amendments, or is it something else?
Thank you, Delegate Queen. The amendment that they're suggesting is the exact same amendment that I put forward. I'm sorry that you don't have it, but the amendment addresses the second and third phases of the appraisal certification. The language in the bill right now only addresses the first phase of the appraisal process. And the amendment, I was told that the amendment was submitted to this committee several hours ago.
Okay. Are there any other questions for Delegate Holmes? Seeing none, thank you, Delegate Holmes. That concludes the testimony on.
Always a pleasure. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Very welcome.
And
We will
goodbye,
now-
Delegate Weigel.
Oh, yeah. We have one virtual witness here, Mr. Scott DiBiagio.
Yes, good afternoon, Madam Chair. For the record, my name is Scott DiBiagio, and I am with the Appraisal Institute. We are in strong support of House Bill 669. Before I begin with my brief comments directed specifically to HB 669, I want to say that we too have heard the very, very disturbing reports in the media where a Black, Latinx, Asian American, or mixed race couple received an appraisal of their property that they believe was influenced by their race or other personal characteristics. Let me be perfectly clear that the AI strongly supports ongoing efforts to diversify the appraisal profession and to ensure fair and equitable appraisals for all Marylanders. Even one story of appraiser bias is too many because it goes against the three fundamental tenets of appraisal practice: independence, objectivity, and impartiality. With all of that said, HB 669 would require the Department of Labor to accept successful completion of PARIA by real estate appraisers in training to satisfy the experience requirements to become licensed. PARIA is a technology-based alternative to the traditional in-person supervisor trainee method of obtaining the required practical experience. PARIA provides another pathway for aspiring appraisers to fulfill their experience requirements. Due to the supervisor trainee model, the number of real estate appraisers has declined significantly since the peak in 2008. Furthermore, the inability of people of color to find supervisors has contributed to the profession being 98% white. Delegate Holmes very ably talked about the proposed amendment that would apply PARIA to the certified residential credential. And the Appraisal Institute respectfully requests the Economic Matters Committee to report HB 669 favorable with the amendments to allow for PARIA for the certified residential appraisal credential. We'll be happy to work with the lead sponsor on these amendments, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be here with you this afternoon.
Thank you, Mr. DiBiagio. Does anyone have questions for the witness? Seeing none, thank you very much. That officially concludes testimony. Delegate Holmes on
Thank you, Madam Chair.
669. Members will now move on to House Bill 906. Delegate Harrison. You bring your panel up with you, Delegate Harrison? Okay, you got your panel.
Good afternoon. I have one person who is sitting here with me for informational purposes. If there's something that's a little bit more technical than I can handle, Ms. Jessica Poitras. I am, for the record, Delegate Andrea Harrison, and I am happy to present to you House Bill 906, Occupational Licensing and Certification, Criminal History, Prohibited Disclosure, and Predetermination Review Process. I brought forth this piece of legislation to reduce barriers for reentry for persons who have been formerly incarcerated. It's important to me that people have second chances to lower the chances of recidivism, encourage successful reentry to society and to our communities, and to help support Maryland businesses. HB 906 creates a pre-clearance process for individuals with criminal records that would require agencies, if requested, to provide binding guidance as to whether or not an individual's criminal record would be prohibitive to licensure. Remember, this is a pre-clearance process. Let me just say that this bill, basically, for an individual to get a license, there's a number of things that they have to do. They would still have to do those things in order to get that license, but prior to perhaps expending money for classes or whatever it takes, they have the opportunity to ask if their background, if their criminal background would be prohibitive of them getting this license. That way, they don't go through this whole process, go to apply for the license only to be denied because of their background. So this is just saying, can I even do this? Is it even acceptable? So that's what this does. It allows these returning citizens to ask to receive a binding determination from licensing authorities whether or not their records will bar them from getting a license. What it does not do is require that each and every organization do this, provide this. It's only if requested. I will say that 39 states have already eased or eliminated licensing barriers for people with criminal backgrounds. 19 states bar licensing agencies from denying individuals with criminal licenses unless their criminal record is directly related to the license. 21 states allow individuals with criminal records to petition licensing authorities to determine if their criminal records will prohibit them from receiving a license, and 13 states impose a time limit for considering past felony convictions. This does not include sexual or violent offenses. We all know that reducing recidivism and job security are proven methods for crime reduction. And so I believe that everyone has a past. Don't ask me about mine. It is our responsibility as lawmakers to show that the past doesn't define anyone. Change and progress are always possible. Together, we can keep improving the quality of formerly incarcerated people in Maryland and their families, communities, and businesses affected by the structural barriers presented by licensing. With that, I do ask for a favorable report on this piece of legislation, and I will take any questions. Mr. Chair, thank you.
Seeing none. Did you go, ma'am?
She's here for technical questions.
Okay. All right. Seeing no questions, next we'll go to the next group. Jeff Guido, Vernita Johnson, and Chris Dews.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair,
Yep.
Vernita Johnson is my legislative director. She just submitted the testimony.
Sorry. Okay, so Jeff and Chris. Go ahead, whenever you're ready, Jeff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, committee members. Jeff Guido on behalf of the Baltimore D.C. Metro Building Trades Council. We support House Bill 906. Many of our crafts require licensing, apprentice licensing, journey person licensing, and master licensing. And we don't feel it is fair if someone has jeopardized that livelihood because of a past mistake. We support the bill, and we think it's fair, and we ask the committee for a favorable report. Thank you.
Fantastic. My name is Christopher Dews. I am speaking on behalf of the Job Opportunities Task Force, a nonprofit organization that fights to ensure that lower wage workers have access to higher wage jobs. Just wanted to flesh out some of these numbers so we are aware of the scope of the reentry aspect of a bill like this. Just to be clear, 25% of working age Marylanders have something that would come up on a routine background check, and that was established by the Bureau of Justice Statistics. And roughly 15,000 Marylanders return to their homes or released from prisons pretty much every single year and have an issue trying to reacclimate to society. The number one reason is because, of course, lack of access to employment. You guys have probably heard me say this in a different capacity 1,001 times, so I'm not going to repeat it, but I will just be blunt and say this. This is a good bill simply because it increases access to employment. It increases access to individuals not wasting their time when they go to training programs like the training program that JLTF has, the Better You Construction Training Program, that trains individuals in carpentry, plumbing, and electrical, only to then have them try to get their licenses and then to be denied because of a criminal record. So what this bill simply does is it kind of sets the individual up for success prior to that asking process. We would, of course, love it if that record barrier was, eliminated altogether when it came to occupational licensing, because if an individual cannot secure employment, housing, education because of their license, because of their record, it's far simpler if they were able to get themselves a trade and get back into the working world and then, become a regular tax-paying citizen. As of right now, there are tremendous barriers to that because of the record, and 55 occupational licenses in the state of Maryland will just deny you outright, regardless of what the record is. So I think this is a good bill. I think it's a step in the right direction, and we urge a favorable report. Thank you.
Delegate Adams.
Thank you, Chair, and I'll be real quick. Jeff, so you're representing construction trades. Give me an example of a occupational license.
Well, you have your apprentice licenses, and then you have your plumbing, electrical, HVAC, the steam fitting, the operating engineers, and then there are several certifications under those as well, rigging, welding, your medical gas. So there's a lot that's involved.
So let's take the plumbing, for example. Does the occupational license relate to work that a plumber would do in a residential setting and a commercial setting?
Absolutely. This law requires that you have the license to perform the work under the direction of a master plumber, whether as an apprentice or a journey person.
Okay. And so this would be a license that a business owner or a service provider? I'm trying to determine at what point does someone who gets an occupational license like this interact directly with consumers and their residents? That's the question.
Well, to do plumbing work or contract plumbing work with the public, you have to have the master plumber gas fitter license and be insured for work. If you're not insured for work, then you cannot contract with the public.
So you're bringing up insurance because you believe that's the way to mitigate a potential risk where someone who gets a license with a criminal background perhaps goes into a house and
Well,
steals
criminal
something.
background doesn't have anything to do with the insurance license. That's just a business requirement for the state of Maryland.
Well, then I missed the point why you brought up insurance. And I'm not trying to
I'm just
push
saying,
hard here.
you said to contract with the public, you must be insured for work.
Let me get to the point. I think we went on a tangent with insurance. A resident, a consumer in a home hires a plumber, and that plumber is licensed, and they get charged, I don't know, $1,000 to do work, and they go into the house, the consumer's not there, there's some, theft that goes on. Well, wouldn't criminal record have some indicator on whether we should be issuing licenses to a plumber with a background who would show up at a home? And I'm just thinking, this one example, I can think of dozens of reasons why we would want to include or at least have as that conversation the background. It implies that license has a meaning and a certification. It's giving a promise, a check or a promise to those that hire a plumber who's licensed. And I'm worried, maybe not convincingly so, that this bill violates that principle, but I remain concerned that licensing there has to be due diligence, and I'm worried that we're bypassing an important part of what I'll call due diligence in that.
Well,
Go ahead, sir.
the license just ensures that you have a working knowledge of the codes.
Okay.
Now, I can give you an example. I was at a state plumbing board meeting several years ago. A young man came in. He'd been working for a contractor as a truck driver. They liked his work ethic. They encouraged him to apply for the apprenticeship program. He applied and was accepted. 3 months into his first year, the plumbing board called him in because he had a felony conviction when he was like 19, breaking into houses, breaking and entering. And they were going to revoke his apprentice license. And the young man literally had to plead for his livelihood. And he said, I'm a single father. I'm raising my daughter. I got into the apprenticeship program. I'm making better choices in life. I'm on my way, moving forward to a career in this industry. And I'm going to, improve myself. And their reasoning, as you suggest, behind it was, well, how do we know if you go into a residence, you're not casing the place to break into it later? And he says, well, I don't do that. I've changed my life. And there's no way you would know anyone was going to do that. And you can't predict what someone will do in the future. But he made a mistake. He paid for it. He did his 1.5 years, did his probation, and now he's on the path. And to deny that license would have been wrong. And the board gave him the waiver and let him continue on with his career, which was the right thing to do.
Okay. And Mr. Chairman, thank you. I don't know if the only thing I would say to you is that I'm not convinced that in every scenario, should this bill pass, we're going to be able to have that kind of qualified conversation, and perhaps I need to learn a little more about the bill.
Is it possible that I can respond to that as well really quickly?
No, because I think
Okay.
it was a narrow issue related to licensing for construction with which I have some interest.
Interesting, I understand.
Thank you.
Delegate Queen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I kind of wanted to ask a question about, did we know instances of where this may help someone? So you had wanted to say something, Mr. Dews, about how we would, kind of mitigate this or how this would help folks. Could you give us some example that would tell us how might this work for someone and where we could cut out some of the concerns people have raised?
Yeah, first and foremost, I do think that a lot of this, the concerns with regards to criminal records and licensing is kind of ideological. Like the example that I came to the table to speak on was one of our specific trainers at our Better You Construction Training Program is a master electrician. He had to get his license renewed, and a charge that was 25 years ago came back up, and he was denied the renewal of his license for that purpose. Now, to me, that was kind of a shock because he had already had the license and somehow it came back. I was confused about that. And so because he could not then work directly as an electrician and necessarily as a master electrician, which is what he was, he then had to, he became a teacher and was only hireable through our training program. So for us, we're looking at this from, the aspect of how long after a person has served their time, has done their entire sentence, has now been released, is now back on the streets, and I believe the bill specifies, I want to say 3 years after passage, do we then look back and say, hey, I know that you served your time, I know that you did all that, but, it's been 25 years, but there's a possibility that inside of this specific house, you may be, as was said, casing the joint. So we're looking at it from that perspective. At what point do we move on and allow people to secure themselves economically? I don't know if that answered the question, Delegate Queen, but if you want to ask it again, I can try to answer it again.
It does. I have to look at the bill to say, does it talk to time frame or something? Because it seems like if you did pay your dues, and if we really are sincere about rehabilitation, then at some point you need to give somebody a second chance. And so maybe we need to figure out that fine line. But
Yeah.
Thank you.
Delegate Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A lot of the licensing for the trades, the apprentice stuff, I'll be honest with you, I don't fully understand to begin with. So I was hoping you could help me understand. I understand you have a master plumber, and I guess you have a master electrician. But if you're on the job and someone is schlepping pipes inside of a building, do they need to have, that's all they're doing, they're bringing stuff in. They have to be an apprentice?
Well, the way it was explained at the State Plumbing Board, someone asked that very question, and the apprentice license is used to track their hours of work, because after so many hours, 7,200 hours, under the direction of a master plumber, you can sit for the journey person exam. That was the reason for the apprentice license, was to track the hours.
And I guess that's where I'm going with it, because I would presume that the person who's carrying the stuff in, because they're just starting out, my question is, they don't have to be licensed, that person, but they...
Well, they could be a helper
right
at that level.
So they don't have to be licensed.
Not necessarily so.
That's a good thing. So then my next question is the person who then eventually becomes an apprentice, they have to take a test to become an apprentice, I presume.
You can apply for the license without taking the test.
You can apply for the license.
Right.
But they still have to work under the direction of a master plumber or electrician.
Yes.
Okay. So why does the apprentice have to be licensed anyway at all if they're and I know that's not necessarily exactly the whole bill, because I understand the bill, but this whole licensing thing drives me crazy to begin with. I think we license too many different things.
Well,
and my question is the apprentice is working under the direction of a person who is fully capable and is watching everything that's being done on the job for good reason, because it could be the owner, or it could be, certainly a master electrician or master plumber. Why does the person doing the actual work along with them have to be licensed at all? Why can't they just be a worker in the company?
because it's not allowable through the state law.
No, I understand it, but is it really necessary?
I believe it is,
Got
because
it.
you need to
I
require
thought you
that
might
you're
say that,
working
but I
knowledge
guess-
of the craft, and proper installation, and then as a journey person, working knowledge of the codes to
Yeah, and just my argument is I think
protect the public from injurious.
My argument is to the delegates' bill, and I get the bill, it seems like it would be so much better if we didn't have this multi-layered licensing stuff, because I think it actually serves, irrespective of your background, to keep people out of industries. I think really that's its purpose, and it just seems counterproductive to have all this licensing.
I respect your opinion, but I have to disagree with it.
I appreciate it, thank you.
Delegate Harrison.
Thank you. I would just reiterate that the primary part of this bill is to allow for or request a predetermination of whether or not it would even be prudent for an individual to try and go through the education to even apply if their criminal background is going to be a problem. What happens sometimes is that an individual may go through a whole program. Let's say they go to the community college for the electrical program, and then so they've spent all of this money, and then they go to apply only for their license, only to be told that what you did in the past is directly impacted in this license, and then therefore they would not have the opportunity to to move into that field. And so as we're talking about licensing, there's so many other types of licensing. I know that these gentlemen are talking specifically about construction, but you got to have a license for, maybe to be a florist or a cosmetologist or all of these other things. And so I would just, keep it in the forefront that all of this is asking you whether or not my background is going to prohibit me from getting a license in your field. And if so, then I'll go on and try and do something else. So I don't, continue to feel like I'm running into a brick wall and be discouraged and perhaps fall back into, the old life. And there is a time that is set for it in here, and it's in the bill. 3 years after you have completed everything, you've not gotten any trouble, hopefully not even a traffic ticket, but if you got a traffic ticket, we won't really count that against you. But that is what this bill is, and it is to try and help individuals to be able to earn a living so that they can be a productive member of society. Thank you.
All right, seeing no further questions for this panel, we'll go to the unfavorables. We have one in person and one virtual. First, we'll go to Matthew Dudzik.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, Mr. Vice Chair, members of the committee. Matthew Dudzik on behalf of the Maryland Board of Physicians. I am testifying today on behalf of the Board of Physicians in opposition to House Bill 906. You have my written testimony, but I do want to make clear that the board is absolutely committed to ensuring that a criminal history does not become a barrier to licensure. It is exceptionally rare that we deny licenses for reasons of criminal history. In fact, if you look at the last fiscal year, we had over 8,000 criminal history record checks. Not a single license was denied for reasons of criminal history. I went into details in our written testimony about some of our specific opposition, but I wanted to particularly focus on the section of the bill that discusses or places limitations on what prior criminal convictions need to be disclosed in the application process. While our denials are rare, it is vital that we are able to fully investigate all of these cases and make a measured response, because a physician in particular is dealing with incredibly vulnerable members of the population. For example, we had a case a few years ago where an applicant had received a misdemeanor sexual abuse charge for sexual contact with a minor. Under investigation, we had found out that while employed as a healthcare provider in a high school in another state, he had begun a sexual relationship with a minor student who was under his care. It was a misdemeanor conviction. There was no term of imprisonment. It did not qualify as a crime of violence. And by our reading of House Bill 906, this is something that that practitioner would not have had to disclose on their application under this bill, which would have denied us the ability to perform that thorough investigation that we felt it was necessary to protect the public. Again, in the vast majority of instances, criminal history is not a barrier to licensure. But we do believe that in order to fulfill our duties as a regulatory agency, we need to be able to investigate these cases properly. And so we urge the committee to submit an unfavorable report.
Thank you, sir. Seeing no questions, we'll go to the virtual testimony. Okay, he's not here. That concludes this bill hearing. Thank you so much. Next, we'll go to House Bill 1097, Delegate Valderrama.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, esteemed members of the Economic Matters Committee. For the record, Chris Valderrama, here to present House Bill 1097, State and Private Construction Contracts Prompt Payment Requirements. Members, one of the most common sources of litigation in the construction industry involves when payment is due for work that is satisfactorily performed. Current law in our state allows a, quote, pay if paid contingency clause, which enables primes and higher tiered subcontractors to delay payment to their subcontractors until the general contractor themselves have been paid for the job in full. This onerous practice sets up a system in which lower tiered subs essentially loan money to the prime or general contractor, much as a bank would do, but without the interest. So not only do these contingency contracts delay the payment to a lower tiered business, but they also shift the burden of non-payment to these subs should a prime contractor become insolvent, bankrupt, or experience other financial distress. So this is, I would attest, and you would attest, that this is particularly unfair since lower tiered businesses are most often, the most vulnerable to cash flow and credit shifts. So what this legislation seeks to address is the issue by outlawing contingency, pay if paid clauses, and replacing them with a prompt pay clause on all public and private contracts. A prompt pay clause benefits both the prime and the subcontractor because it requires the contracting party to pay for work which was satisfactorily performed within 60 days of receipt of an invoice. Subs would be paid within 7 days of receipt of payment by the prime contractor, but a longer delay would be prohibited. I would note well that payment may be withheld by the general or upstream subcontractor for work or other breach of a contract if written notice and an explanatory statement is made for any withholding of payment. So moreover, this legislation does not apply to contracts made by all levels of government who will continue to be assessed a 9% annual interest rate for late payment by government entities. So this legislation is being modeled after that was enacted by Across the Bridge in Virginia last year and follows longstanding in-law in California, North Carolina, Nevada, and New York. So once reviewing this legislation, should this pass, it would ensure financial stability, predictability, and continuity of work in the construction field. And for all the reasons I mentioned, I would urge the committee to have a favorable report of House Bill 1097. I would like to note that I am very well aware there are good contractors, bad contractors, just like in any other industry. We have good apples, bad apples. I have been approached by many advocates for the bill, in opposition to the bill, and I'm willing to work with all involved. I have even have people drop by my office and drop off proposed amendments. I'm very well aware of all the input that is coming in for this piece of legislation, and with that, happy to work with everyone on this bill. And Mr. Chairman, if my panel could proceed. Thank you.
Good afternoon, chairs and members of the committee. My name is Calvin Mims. I am president and owner of Calamai Electrical Company in Baltimore City. I am here to testify in support of House Bill 1097. This piece of legislation is very important to contractors and subcontractors alike. But I believe it is more important to subcontractors and uncapitalized small contractors throughout the state of Maryland. All subcontract agreements have either a pay-if-paid clause or a pay-when-paid clause in them. For those of you whom are not familiar, a pay-if-paid clause means that the prime contractor is under no obligation to pay the subcontractor unless and until the contractor receives payment from the owner or municipality. Lack of payment from the owner or municipality could be totally the contractor's fault. However, the subcontractor still cannot get paid until the prime contractor is paid. A pay-when-paid clause delays the time in which a general contractor or prime contractor has to pay a subcontractor. Even this could take several months before the subcontractor is paid. Many contractors will try to force a subcontractor to sign a pay-of-paid contract if the subcontractor wants to do business. I personally would not sign one, but there are many small contractors that feel that they have to sign these contracts if they want to do business. Fortunately, with age, I've felt that I don't have to do this. In some cases, there are some, and I repeat, some unscrupulous owners and general contractors that will hold funds just to reduce the value of what is owed to negotiate timely payments. For this reason, on behalf of Marilyn Nika, ACE, and myself, I ask for a favorable report on this bill. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, sir. And before we go to the next gentleman, I just want to recognize our colleagues from HGO, Delegates Kipke, Johnson, and Kaiser, who are here with us as this is jointly assigned. Go ahead, sir.
Good afternoon, Vice Chair Crosby and esteemed members of the House Economics Matter Committee. My name is Thomas Bello. I'm here on behalf of the 200 mechanical subcontracting firms who represent the Mechanical Contractors Association of Metro Washington, which is called MCA, based in Rockville, Maryland. House Bill 1097 provides protection from our businesses who have been forced to carry the financial burden of delayed payments for work performed. This bill ensures that all businesses, small and large, are protected from upstream general contractors and owners who fail to make payments in a timely manner. In my tenure with the MCA, I've seen businesses fold, go out of business as a result of these unfortunate business practices. The largest liability that our contractors face is maintaining positive cash flow, as they're faced with overhead costs, maintaining supplies, materials, they have payrolls to meet, they have fringe benefits to pay. Every contractor within the MCA pays a fair wage, pays health benefits, retirement savings, health and welfare benefits to their members, to their employees. Overall, House Bill 1097 provides equitable and fair relief to our small and large subcontractors. All businesses within the state of Maryland, all of our contractors within the state of Maryland. House Bill compresses the inequality between the prime contractor, the general contractor, and the subcontractor that this industry has faced for many, many years. Included in my written testimony is letters of support from members of the MCAMW. They can speak to the specifics of the financial burdens that they face day in and day out within this industry. For these reasons, I ask for a favorable report from the committee. Thank you very much for your time.
My name is Ike Casey. I'm the Executive Director of the American Subcontractors Association of Metro Washington, and I also speak for ACE, the Alliance for Construction Excellence, which includes these associations that are here. And I'm also honored to sit beside my favorite legislator in the world. She helped my daughter when we really needed help about 20 years ago, and I'm glad I'm able to say that publicly. But the reason I'm here is because subcontractors need this protection. The world's changing out there. Virginia, North Carolina, the whole country is going to have this legislation soon because it's not fair for a subcontractor to work, complete the work, invoice it properly, and not get paid. And I'm speaking for all the subcontractors. I haven't heard of any subcontractor who is opposed to this legislation. And Delegate Adams, I don't think you are. But I won't speak for you, but I'm sure you don't. You understand the situation. And so I hope that you will pass this. There are many of our general contractors that are partners with ASA, and they represent the largest in this area. They do a lot of work in this area. None of them have come to me and said, you can't do this, don't pass this bill, because they know it's fair. And that's why we're very much in favor of it. I'd like just for a second in my last 20 seconds to speak for the finishing contractors. Because a lot of finishing contractors, and I know you are one, sir, are painting contractors, drywall contractors, and they come into these commercial jobs when everything's been messed up and they've got to try to fix it. And they don't get paid. if the owner's mad because something's not right, they don't get paid. And I don't have but 1 second, so that's all. Thank you.
Mr. Mano, I do not have you signed up to testify. Okay. Delegate Adams.
Okay. So, thank you. You know, the bill is interesting because I'm wondering if we're solving a problem or a symptom of a problem, which is why do the owners not pay their bill? And I do, on balance, agree with the bill. In fact, I like the bill. But I'm curious, if I was a prime contractor, and I'm not, the world I would live in with owners who don't pay their obligations. And I wonder how often these delays in payments come because owners have leverage in the conversation. There's something in that prime contract that gets taken advantage of, or maybe an owner just builds something and the revenue stream didn't come and they're stuck. And I'm just kind of curious from anybody on the panel, and Roger, I would have asked if you were willing to speak up and the committee will let it. I just think that there's some questions going to what are we trying to solve under the legislation. I mean, I have companion legislation related to retainage, but the difference on retainage is more akin to, I believe, that the money gets paid and the contractors or the owner just simply don't pay the bill because there's no timeline, there's no reasonable timeline. But the question is what is the problem that we're trying to solve? And is this bill a symptom? Are we resolving a symptom, or is it really going to get to the crux of the issue? So, Mr. Chair, I'm asking the question of anybody there, but that's.
Go ahead, sir, in the middle.
Yeah.
I think it's a legitimate question, of course, and the example I have is I have a member, this happened in Virginia, but I'm sure it's happened in Maryland too, where everybody did their work, everything was fine, but the window contractor put the windows in backwards. And the owner would not pay for 6 months until the windows were fixed. And the window contractor was almost out of business. So that was, you can imagine the challenge the owner has if they're not happy with the job. Owners want the job to work. They want the doors to open and close. They want the lights to come on and the air conditioning to work.
Yeah.
But if they don't and they don't pay, everybody suffers if this bill passes. If this bill doesn't pass, the subcontractors are the ones that suffer the most. They're the ones that carry all the risk because that owner didn't pay.
Yeah, so it's a question of leverage and where the power exists, and this bill puts the power to the people that do the work, I guess is your.
Well, it makes it equal in my mind. I'm sorry. It makes it equal in my mind.
That's fine.
Delegate Johnson. The other Delegate Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, panel, for coming with the information today. I do see opposition letters from Maryland Building Industry Association, Maryland Transportation Building Materials Association, Maryland Asphalt Association, and the Maryland Minority Contractor Association, Inc. So, do you think this bill would have an adverse effect on our local general contractors who didn't have as deep pockets bidding on jobs for the state of Maryland?
If I may, do you mind if I answer?
I'm not signed up.
Oh. That's an interesting question, but where are we asking the general contractors to finance the construction? No. Nobody's asking the general contractors, with this bill, nobody's asking the general contractors to finance the construction. If construction doesn't, if payments don't flow, then someone has to be responsible. And right now, all three parties, if this bill passes, all three parties will be responsible, not just the subcontractor.
So can you tell me, if a sub performs a job in the front end of a general construction job, does the general contractor get paid in phases? Is he going to get paid in time to meet that 60-day requirement of a subcontractor that did perform work on the front end of a job?
The owner decides when they want to pay. It's not always, the subs don't control that, the general contractors don't control that. But this bill has been successful in North Carolina because we had in our testimony in Virginia, we had a general contractor that was asked, how do you do it in North Carolina? He said, well, we have to be careful in North Carolina. Now, isn't that what we're asking? We're just asking the general contractor to be careful about the owner that they're working with to make sure that that owner is solvent and is going to pay the bill.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right,
That's okay.
seeing,
Can I, Mr. Chairman?
Oh, yeah,
I
go
just
ahead.
wanted to follow up really quickly. As I prefaced in the beginning of my testimony, I'm very well aware of the issues and concerns of those that are opposed to this legislation. I do want to point out, I was in receipt and have spoken to the advocates on behalf of the minority business, the MBEs and such. I am a minority, so I am not out to get at the minorities, but as Mr. Casey said earlier, with this legislation, it would spread out the burden and not just be on the people, the subs who are very low, who, as I mentioned in my testimony, the most affected because they're the ones who are lower income. And I know this doesn't really affect the big contractors because they do have the funds, but there has to be a middle way in resolving this, and which is why I mentioned that earlier in my testimony.
Delegate Harrison.
Thank you. In my previous legislative life, one of the things that we often heard was that the government doesn't pay on time, doesn't pay the prime government. And it grieves me being, a legislator back in local government and then also here, the fact that it seems as though government takes their time because of their processes that they have to go through and all of the red tape. How often are you finding that? I know that there have been several pieces of legislation that have been introduced. I'm not sure how many of them have passed, both local and on state, with like a net 15 as opposed to a net 30, or whenever the government decides they want to process the invoice, because it seems that if the prime is, one would hope that if the prime or the general is getting paid, that they would in fact be paying their subs, which I know does, in the past anyway, has not always occurred. So I don't know, Mr. Mano seems like he has, is it okay?
Mr. Mano did not sign up, so if
Okay, I'm
anybody else
sorry.
wants to answer it.
If I may, Mr.
Yep,
Chairman.
go ahead.
Delegate Harrison had someone who wasn't signed up but was here for informational purposes and technicalities.
All right, we'll let it slide, even though I wasn't here for that.
Delegate Harrison, thank you. It's interesting. I mean, this bill is the identical bill to the Virginia bill that passed last year, bipartisan. This is kind of a rare moment in this committee, on which I sat for 4 years, where you have labor, non-unions, management, all on the same page for the most part, with the exception of some opposition that you'll hear. It's the Virginia bill is different in one respect. Virginia actually has a better rate of penalty. So if the state doesn't pay on a Virginia project, they pay 12%. Maryland, it's 9%. We would support, and I say this on behalf of Steamfitters 602, Plumbers Local 5, Mechanical Contractors Association, and a large coalition, we'd support a higher state penalty. But the point of the penalty is that if the state doesn't pay and ends up paying a 9% interest rate, we think it should be higher, but 9% interest rate, the prime contractor has to pay a 9% interest rate. Everybody ends up paying that interest rate. So what the bill does is actually prevent this cascading downstream pain by passing on this interest rate, which should be higher, to everybody downstream.
All right, I didn't get that, but,
Virginia's 12, we're 9.
I guess my point that, and then I guess I'll just end with this, is that, I've heard many times from contractors, the problem is that the government entity, whatever that is, just is not paying on time, and therefore those, whether it's the prime or /general, and therefore the subs are not getting paid. And those subs are the ones that then really end up having a hard time because, you know, they're operating on razor-thin margins as it is. And so is it still so that we have trouble with, and I'm only speaking for government at this point, paying so that everyone down the line can get paid? And I guess any one of the other panelists who perhaps have had government contracts could answer. Yes, no?
Calvin, you want to answer?
I want to just say one thing on that.
Who's in the mic, please?
Oh, I'm sorry. What you're saying is true. The government can come up with a better process of paying. But in some cases, the government has paid general contractors, or prime contractors, and the subcontractors have no way of knowing whether that contract has been paid or not. And sometimes those funds are held up, and we're waiting to be paid, not knowing whether they've been paid or not. So in any legislation, there's always going to be some errors, there's always going to be some way of bettering. But I just feel that this is a good start.
Thank you.
Delegate Ampry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So one of the concerns I have with this bill is the impact that it would have on our prime contractors, people of color. And one of the things I'm concerned about is if we're going to have this payment structure, I feel like those with the biggest, deepest pockets are going to be most advantageous to get more contracts. So I'd like to know, you've given the examples of North Carolina, Virginia, has this impacted the amount of minority prime contractors in those states? Have they hit their numbers? Or have those numbers grown? What has been the impact on those communities? And has it been good for those communities? So that's kind of just want to know. You all given the North Carolina and Virginia talk. I just want to know how is that doing in North Carolina and Virginia?
I wish I could answer that. I really can't give you exact figures, but this has been the law in North Carolina since the 80s. And I think if you look at the number of minority prime contractors that have grown in North Carolina from the 80s till today, you'll see a large number. And it's my opinion, it's not fact that I can back up, that this would not affect minority contractors. All it would do is require them to get in the trenches and fight for payment as hard as the subcontractors have to fight for them. Whether they're minority or not, they would all be in the same fight to get that payment.
Okay.
Delegate Howard.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Just walk me through that process a little bit. I'm a little bit confused. You said that the subcontractors wouldn't know when the funds were released when you're talking about government jobs. I mean, is that a secret? Like, I don't understand why they wouldn't know that. I mean, is there like a front-facing person, a contact, some type of process where you would be made available, or at least that information would be available to you that those funds have been released?
Until recently, there was no way for a subcontractor to know. There was some legislation that was presented, and I'm not sure if it was passed or not, where you could go online and find out any specific project, whether a contract has been paid or not.
Quite frankly, that's what I figured. That's why I was surprised.
But I don't know if that legislation was passed.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Go ahead.
But before that, there was no way of knowing.
Right. Last year, that was enacted.
Okay.
And most subcontractors.
So it's relative. It's very new.
It's available, but most subcontractors don't use it. They just don't know how to find it. They just know they're mad because they can't get paid.
Yeah. I mean, I get it, but that's kind of not my problem. Like, you know what I mean?
Agree.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate your answers.
Two questions. First, I know that Delegate Ampry asked a question on minority ownership, and it was made that minority contractors in North Carolina have grown. I'm curious, have they grown at the same rate the state of Maryland has grown. And that's fine if you don't know the answer. Just let us know, please, once you get the answer. I think that would be helpful. And then the second, this bill is solely around construction in those other states. Is it expanded to other industries, or is it still just construction? So does it apply to any state contract? Well, I shouldn't say state contract, any contract that I guess there would be a prime contractor and a sub.
In Virginia and Maryland, in Virginia and North Carolina, it's strictly construction, not other contracts that would have subcontract.
All right, thank you. Delegate Fisher.
Thanks. Does this apply to retainage in contracts?
It doesn't change retainage.
Does it apply to it?
If retainage was, I'm not a lawyer. I don't know that I should answer.
Well, retainage is not necessarily, it's a common process in contracting, right? So you're holding back 10%, maybe 15% contractually because you're waiting for the building permit and the inspections to take place. Does this apply to that?
I yield. Are you going to answer?
It doesn't circumvent that.
So this bill does not apply to retainage. You still have to pay 9% if you contractually agree to retainage because the part of the subcontractor's job has not been approved yet and inspected yet by the local inspectors.
So you have to pay, or everyone in the chain has to pay, as long as the work was performed satisfactorily.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, seeing no further questions, that concludes this panel. I do have Terraria Smalls. Is that T Smalls? He signed up in person, but I don't see him. Okay, all right. I do not have any other favorable. We'll now go to the unfavorable. All four can come up at once. I have P.J. Hogan, Sheila Dixon, Robert Harrington, and Alvin Smith. And you can start once ready. Okay. Dan Kapner can come up with you.
Who do you want to go first? Go ahead. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My name is Lisa Harris-Jones, and I'm here on behalf of the Maryland Minority Contractors Association. I've been representing the Maryland Minority Contractors. It's an organization made up of both subcontractors and general contractors for over 25 years, sometimes on a pro bono basis, other times. I believe in this organization to the point where, as I sit here today, we're here in opposition of House Bill 1097, in that this bill does not take in consideration of the fact that there are already regulations, laws already in place, ensuring that subcontractors are paid in a timely manner. Paid with paid clauses are negotiated between generals and their subcontractors. There's nothing illegal about a paid when paid clause. The biggest problem that generals and subcontractors are having in the state is specifically with minority contractors who, quite frankly, don't get jobs in the private sector. They rely on state and local work, is that governments just don't pay on time. And it's been a discussion within this committee. It's been a discussion on commissions. We're looking to enforce the state and local governments to pay their generals on time. Instead, this bill would look to a general contractor, turn them into a bank financing a project for a state and an owner, instead of making the state or the government pay their general on time. It would completely, in most cases, and you'll hear from Robert Harrington, for example, put a minority contractor who worked their way over 20-some years to the point that they can bid as a prime, and push them out of the ability to do that anymore, because they would, I think he will share that he would have to increase his financing 3 times, his surety, his bonding as well. and there would no longer be an incentive to bid on a state or local contract if this bill was in place. We oppose the bill.
Good afternoon. Sheila Dixon with the Maryland Minority Contractors Association. I've been with them for the last 9 years. We have a database of over 200 members, and it's prime contractors, minority contractors, subcontractors, as well as very small contractors. And this bill, for those prime contractors, and most of those prime contractors are African-American contractors, and I know earlier it was noted, would have a real challenge. In most cases, when they can, they pay their subcontractors because a lot of them started as subs and they understood and they understand the challenges that subcontractors go through. But majority of them do government work. And as a result of that, because of the dysfunction of how government works at the county level in some cases, local level, as well as even state, part of what I've done for the last 2 years is really put the fire under the feet within certain agencies to, one, make sure that the prime is being paid so that the sub can be paid. But in a lot of cases, these African-American companies who are majority members of our association would literally be out of business. Capital, no matter being prime or sub, is a challenge that we have to address, which is a whole different issue. But it will put a lot of pressure and put a lot of these companies who have grown in the state of Maryland based on laws that have changed, put them out of business.
Yes. Good afternoon. My name is Robert Harrington. I'm the owner of R.E. Harrington Plumbing and Heating. I do municipality work for Baltimore City, and this bill would hurt my company and others, minority companies in Baltimore City. As Ms. Dixon and Ms. Jones had said, most of the problems is with the municipalities. Every month we turn in an invoice, and once that invoice has been signed off, the municipality is supposed to pay in 30 days. And once I receive payment, in 7 days I'm supposed to pay my sub. The major problem now is with the state and city is the organization on how to get paid. If this bill is passed, it would hurt companies like mine and the up-and-coming contractors that's trying to become general contractors. That means we will have to go to our banks and increase our line of credit to pay subs. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, good afternoon. My name is Dan Kapner. I'm a senior lawyer at Clark Construction, which has more than a century of history building in Maryland. We support the prompt payment of our trade partners. A project's success depends on the steady flow of funding from owners downstream to contractors of all tiers, and it is a core value of our company that our trade partners are paid timely and fairly. But we have significant concerns with this bill as drafted. First, it undermines existing law. Maryland has a Prompt Payment Act, a trust fund statute, and a robust lien law that requires a trial to be held within 6 months, which is not the case in DC or Virginia. And we do not limit a lien to work performed in the 150 days before a lien notice, which is the rule in Virginia. But this bill protects only first-tier subcontractors, not the general contractor or lower-tier subs, including small and diverse companies. And it grants owners a broad statutory basis to withhold funds, even for undisputed work in place. Owners may withhold for a contractor's, quote, non-compliance with the contract, including a technical or minor non-compliance that has no relation to the invoiced work. And this will trump any agreed contract standard. Also, payment is required only for an invoice following, quote, satisfactory completion of the work, which is a vague and undefined standard. The existing laws will be undermined if an owner relies on these new standards to deny payment or oppose a lien claim. Second, public owners have no express payment obligation, even though contractors do, which will disincentivize bidding for public work and increase costs. The bill disproportionately shifts the risk of non-payment from owners who hold the checkbook to first-tier contractors and forces them to finance work and become a bank. Unless the bill is significantly revised, we urge the committee to oppose it. We have provided the sponsor with suggested amendments and stand ready to work with the bill sponsor and committee. Thank you.
Okay, quickly before we go to questions, and I do see one. My list here, I got a little bit turned around. So after we complete this, there's one more unfavorable, then we'll take the 2 remaining favorable, which I know I haven't called on yet. With that said, Delegate Adams.
Okay, thank you very much. And the testimony, I think, Lisa, you alluded to it, and then the gentleman at the end there, the same, is that the burden, it seems like you agree with the bill, but for who we're putting the burden on. So in other words, if the owner is the responsible party that's not doing their job under contract, which is the work's complete and pay the bill, your testimony is they're not paying the bill, ergo, how can you pass the expense or the cost or the payment down to your subcontractors? So that's a question that relates to the principle of the bill you agree with. You don't like where the burden is being laid under this piece of legislation.
That's right. We believe that our trade partners need to be paid timely, and we work tirelessly to ensure that we can get paid by owners so that we can pay our subs and so that the money can flow downstream. But this bill, it transfers that risk of non-payment from the owner to the contractor. And by creating a new standard that's undefined and vague, it creates a shield for owners to now have a stronger position to deny payment, which we have a significant concern about. And in addition, I will say, this bill is different than the bill in Virginia. There's been discussion today about how, this is the same bill. This is not the same bill. The bill in Virginia requires the payment obligations to flow downstream. It has a definition of subcontractor that includes lower tier subcontractors, which includes small and diverse companies. This bill protects only first tier subcontractors, so it's not the same.
Sure.
I just want to add, what I shared was we believe there's no need for the legislation. The intent behind the legislation of making sure subcontractors get paid, of course we agree with that, as we agree with getting generals paid on time. Our point is that there are already, as he shared, there's already laws on the book to make sure that, generals and subs are paid in a timely manner. But again, the problem is not with the general and the prime. The problem is with government paying their generals in a timely manner. So I just want to make that distinction. I think there's no need for a bill. There's a need for some form of enforcement or pressure to be placed on agencies and government and municipalities to pay their generals on time.
Well, I mean, and I think what I was asking implied your response, which is we're not in a disagreement with the principle of it, even if it's in law according to your testimony, but rather where the burden's being placed. And my second question, which I think is equally important, is that there is a prime contract between the owner and the general contractor. And I've always thought to myself, it's not the same contract that the general contractor engages with their subs. In other words, there is a relationship that happens between the owner and the contractor. And in those contracts, I wonder, and it's worth asking the question since we have one contractor here, is there incentive, is there skin in the game in the contractor's shoes to actually put the owner's feet to the fire, ergo, hey, pay the bill or expect us to respond legally, maybe stop work? The point is, at what point does the contractor have skin in the game? This bill, the best way for me to describe it, is asking and then answering the question that the general contractor can and should have more skin in the game when it comes to paying your bill. I will say, just because I'm a market participant, I have a accounts receivable list. I got to tell you, some of the lines go over 120 days, and my skin in the game's big, but I have no leverage. That's the point. There's no leverage. But you as the contractors do have leverage. The question is, do you exercise it between a contract between the owner and you or not? And I would suggest that there's some opportunity for improvement, which was my testimony for the other side, which is that, what are we solving here? What's the symptom? Or is this actually, are we going to solve the problem here in Annapolis?
Nope, no question posed. Was it? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, let me answer it in this way. If one were to assume that general contractors do not go to significant lengths to exercise any and all leverage that they may have to get paid by the owner, if one were to make that assumption, they would be wrong, okay? We do everything we can to get paid by owner, as every general contractor does. Now, where are their problems? Well, there was discussion before about public procurements. Public jobs, oftentimes, contractors are not in a position to engage in substantial negotiations and require a government entity to have a net 30 clause. A lot of times these contracts are take it or leave it. They're go or no go. And if this committee were to want to take any action to try and ensure that subcontractors of all tiers and the general contractor are paid timely, then the way to address those efforts would be to ensure that owners make payment and make payment timely.
Okay, Delegate Valderrama.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, panelists, for being here. As I prefaced in my testimony, I brought this forth because I'm looking out for the underdogs, and I think we can all attest that most oftentimes it's the sub who's the most likely to suffer, and most likely is also a minority. So I congratulate you, sir, on your business. I think that's great that you have your contracting business. The reason I meant, a couple of my questions were answered earlier from someone else, but if I misheard, and I can't remember if it was one of you gentlemen who said, I don't know if I misheard about any prime contractor, why would any prime contractor, if they were to withhold payment to a sub, I want to make sure I heard you right. Were you saying that a prime contractor why would any prime contractor withhold payment to a sub when they have already been paid by an owner? Now, did I mishear any statement of that sort? And if I did, I apologize, because I was trying to multitask at the same time.
No, but I would say that would be in violation of the existing Prompt Payment Act, which we have.
So I also want to mention, you made commentary that amendments were provided. I've never received those amendments, not from you anyway. I have received amendments from another advocate. So I would be interested in looking forward to that. And I know respectfully, Ms. Harris-Jones and I have spoke at length as well on this bill, and I totally get it. I just want to make sure everyone here gets why I even submitted it, right? If, I think everyone sees where the burden is laying. And I know commentary was made that maybe it should just be more about reinforcement, but clearly it's not working. And for us to reinforce it, I'm not sure how we would do that. And given that it was mentioned that this bill is in existence in North Carolina, however, it may not be exactly the same or not. It's been there since the 80s. So is there a way that if this bill were to move forward, whether it went to subcommittee or not, that all parties involved would be willing? Because clearly there's a need, and reinforcing, and the big contractors aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing. I'm not saying all of them, but a good majority of them. And again, I will just end by saying that the sub is the one who carries the most burden, in my opinion, not fact, and a lot of times is the minority as well. So is there a way, or would there be a way?
You said a lot.
Sorry.
I mean, and again, I think, again, that, for me, as I sit here representing the minority contractors, both general and subs, I mean, to put a bill in like this in an effort to make sure all are paid, it's not the right bill. It's not the right method. The method is to look at the laws and regs that are already on the books and make government pay generals and primes on time. To make a general a bank for government or an owner is not the solution. You're killing, in this case, minority contractors. I went to school, we went to high school together. I remember when he was an apprentice, a plumber, and he has made his way to the point that he is one of the largest utility contractors in the state of Maryland. And he makes a point to make sure that he hires minority and women contractors as his subs. If you put him out of business, you're hurting the minority and women subcontractors that, quite frankly, majority contractors have no interest in hiring unless there's an MBE, WBE program making them do it. This is not the solution. You're going to kill his business and others like him. We will sit down, of course, we will sit at a table and try to work with you and others to figure out how we can get government and owners, private owners, to do what the law prescribes for them to do, and that's to pay their bills on time, so that generals can then pay their subs timely.
I will just, and I appreciate that response, I will just end to reiterate, I'm not here to kill minority businesses, but I am looking out for the minorities who are the subs who should not carry the burden, and I know I sound like a broken record. With that said, you're saying putting this legislation would kill your businesses, but if it's in existence in law already in other states and it hasn't killed their businesses.
We don't
now I
know yet, Virginia just passed.
Correct, but North Carolina's been there since the 80s, and another state, if we get that information, I think that would be pertinent in our discussion. So I will just end it, but thank you so much.
Delegate Shi.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm wondering, in the current law, besides the penalty for late payment, which is like 9%, right? Are there other penalties for prime contractors to not pay promptly once they have received a payment themselves? Like, for example, to not be able to bid for contractors going forward or anything like that?
So in Baltimore City, if you don't pay a subcontractor, they can withhold your funds. So if you get through 1 month and every sub has to sign an acknowledgement form, and when the next month comes in, that sub has to sign off that he got paid. If he didn't get paid, then the city has the right to withhold funds.
So it's purely financial?
Pretty much, yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you.
To the gentleman from Clark Construction, just a quick Google comparing what passed in Virginia to this law. It looks pretty similar. Granted, slight differences maybe in code and where it is, but it looks like they took that and put it in place. Knowing that it just passed, are you guys still bidding in contracts in Virginia?
We are bidding, of course, but.
Thank you. That's it. Okay. So next I have Alvin Smith, and he's the final for the unfavorable.
Yeah, he had a emergency,
Okay.
so he texted me.
Thank you, Ms. Dixon. All right, well, that concludes this panel. And like I said, my bad. I shouldn't have stereotyped. I put Bruce Bariano in the second part of it, but now we have Bruce Bariano in favor, as well as William Yull.
I'm sorry, I was in another committee.
You're good.
But in the sake of time, I think a good discussion is had on this, and I'll defer. And
All right.
I work with ACE, and we'll be very happy to work with those that oppose this bill and see if we can come up with something reasonable.
Thank you, Mr. Bariano. All right. Seeing no further witnesses, that concludes this hearing. Next, we will go to House Bill 140, which is Delegate Polakovich-Carr and Charkoudian.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'll just get started while my panel joins me. So for the record, I'm Delegate Julie Polakovich-Carr, here to present House Bill 140. This legislation would ensure that out-of-work Marylanders continue to receive at least some of their unemployment benefits, even when there's been an error and their unemployment case has been subject to an overpayment by the Department of Labor. So overpayment of unemployment benefits can occur at no fault for the applicant. For instance, if there was an error in reporting by their former employer or just human error by the Department of Labor. And to be clear, this bill is not about fraudulent cases. This is about cases where there was, an innocent error by one of the parties. So right now, Maryland recovers 100% of weekly UI benefits until the overpayment is fully repaid. And this is leaving the unemployed person with no income stream for themselves and their family to pay for housing, food, and other basic needs. So the bill would cap the recovery rate at up to 50% of the weekly benefits. And for someone who's getting a very small amount of benefits, $100 or less, it would cap it at 25% or less. And this is very much in line with actions taken by other states. 25 states currently cap overpayment recovery at no more than 50%. And within that list of states, 8 states cap it at no more than 25%. So this puts us in line with other states. It also would align us with actions by the federal government. Federal unemployment programs also have a 50% recovery cap. This is legislation that we have shared with the U.S. Department of Labor, and it has passed their conformity review. So in sum, this is a bill that will allow Maryland to fully recoup the entirety of UI overpayments, but just over a longer period of time, and to basically ensure that Marylanders who are out of work and looking for work continue to receive this important social safety net benefit. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My name is Lucy Zoe, and I'm an attorney with the Public Justice Center and the Center's Workplace Justice Project. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on behalf of HB 140, and thank you to Delegate Polakovich-Carr and Delegate Charkoudian for sponsoring this important bill. As you've heard, right now, Maryland law allows the Department of Labor to withhold the full amount of an individual's weekly unemployment benefits to recoup an overpayment, even if that overpayment was not the result of misrepresentation, fraud, or any other wrongdoing on the part of the individual, what we've shorthanded as non-fraud overpayments. Withholding 100% of someone's weekly benefits can create significant and unfair hardship for those who depend on those benefits to afford basic necessities. And as you've heard, it's also out of step with what many other states and the federal government already do when it comes to recouping non-fraud overpayments. Our written testimony includes a statement from Mr. William Sanders, a Public Justice Center client who could not attend today's hearing, but who wanted to express his support for the bill because of his own personal experience struggling to afford food, rent, and gas when the department withheld all or nearly all of his benefits to recover an overpayment that was not Mr. Sanders' fault. HB 140 proposes a simple change to the law, but it's one that would have a hugely meaningful impact for people like Mr. Sanders. For non-fraud overpayments, the bill would cap the rate of benefit offsets to 50% of the weekly benefit amount, and if an individual's weekly benefit is $100 or less, the Department of Labor could offset no more than 25%. Under this bill, the department could still recoup the full amount of the overpayment over time, but it would ensure that in the meantime, unemployed Marylanders who are overpaid through no fault of their own would still receive some benefits to help them get by. For these reasons, we respectfully ask for a favorable report. Thank you.
Greetings. My name is Cornelia Bright Gordon, and I am speaking to you from Maryland Legal Aid. So Maryland Legal Aid is a nonprofit law firm that provides free legal services to the state's low-income and vulnerable residents. Our offices serve residents in each of Maryland's 24 jurisdictions and handle a range of matters, including unemployment law. Now, I personally have seen overpayments and been working with overpayments for about 35 years of my law practice. Overpayments happen in all government programs, and they frequently occur because a state or federal government agency makes a mistake in the administration of their statute. And this happens all over the country. For example, the Social Security, Retirement, Disability, and SNAP programs all process overpayments. But most of them have systems in place where if the recipient is not at fault, there are programs that do not reduce their benefits, their current benefits, to zero. Good governance recognizes that it's important to make sure that the recovery process maintains a cautious review and does not systematically impoverish people. I want you to know that this bill codifies a process that has long existed, and prior to the pandemic, Maryland Legal Aid routinely obtained a 50% reduction in benefits from the Department of Labor to allow our clients to both repay an overpayment and maintain some current benefit that they were able to receive. The new Maryland Department of Labor does not acknowledge this regularly occurring process that they believed in and cooperated with in the past. So if I could sum up, I would just say Maryland Legal Aid supports this bill without amendment and urges the committee to issue a favorable report.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, my name is Robin McKinney. I'm the co-founder and CEO of the CASH Campaign of Maryland. CASH stands for Creating Assets, Savings, and Hope, and we help low-income Marylanders to be financially secure. We're here in strong support of this bill, most importantly because the unemployment insurance is a safety net program. In order for it to be a safety net program, people have to have the money in their pocket. So when errors happen, as again happens in all sorts of different government programs, we need to make sure that we're maximizing all that money going back into people's pockets now so that they can meet their basic needs. I worked this year with someone named Mrs. Baker who had an overpayment, again, that was a process challenge through no fault of her own, through no fraudulent issues, and she was immediately not able to eat and had to go to the food bank, had to go through other services. We had to get her on other social service programs just because they had cut back 100% of her benefit. For these reasons, we urge a favorable report.
Delegate Aarons.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just real quickly, how many people, unemployment's 26 weeks, right? And we've all had our experiences with our employment over the last couple of years. How many people actually are in need of this legislation?
I'll defer if anyone on my panel has more specific information, but I'll note in the fiscal note, they get into that a little bit at the bottom of page 2, top of page 3. There was about $9 million in overpayments last year.
Okay, are they existing accounts? Because what this bill is telling me is that you have to be on unemployment in order for them to take your unemployment. So you're saying that we're finding out we're overpaying them, and we're discussing that with them, and we're doing that all within 26 weeks.
That's
No,
right. Well,
if I may answer this, I have seen many overpayments that were created many years ago, and my client was completely unaware of them simply because of an address change, and people do change their addresses over 20 and 30 years. But this can affect hundreds of people annually, in my opinion.
I'll just add that the particular process we're talking about in this bill, though, does most impact the people who are currently still within that 26-week period and still receiving unemployment benefits where.
I'd like to see that, because I'll tell you what, I have people who've been looking for unemployment for quite a while, and I know we're getting out of that right now, but I have not been able to get a whole lot of things resolved in 26 weeks to where they're to that date. But thank you for the information. I'm confused about the fact that we're going back, we're retro like years and years, and we haven't been able to find them, that we've allowed those things to be that lax. That's just confusing to me.
I understand, and it is confusing to me as well. They are currently receiving benefits, but they didn't know that there was an old overpayment out there. That can happen and routinely happens.
Okay, thank you.
Delegate Weibel.
Mr. Chairman, so what happens if unemployment benefits end and there's an uncollected balance? How do they recover that?
So like any other debt owed to the state, we have a central collections unit that can go after that debt. One of the most effective ways that we collect debts, whether it's overpayments from unemployment or any other kind of state debt, is withholding someone's income tax refund. And the comptroller's office basically has an automated process that they do that through the central collections unit.
So none of that changes under this bill. It just creates the potential that more of those uncollected balances may exist?
That's right. We're not changing anything in terms of the other debt collection process.
All right. Thank you.
Also, I might add that the claimants are sued by the state regularly for overpayments.
Okay, seeing no further questions, that concludes this panel. Next, we have, for information, we have Secretary Wu and Andrew Folginiti.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair and members of the committee. I'm Portia Wu from the Department of Labor. As has already been discussed, this bill would limit the amounts the department can offset weekly from unemployment insurance benefit payments to recover non-fraud overpayments, but it does not impact the department's ability to utilize other tools to collect those overpayments. I wanted to note that the department does have the fiduciary duty to employers, taxpayers, and the public to ensure payments out of the UI Trust Fund go to eligible claimants. And so that means we do have the responsibility to recover improper overpayments. At the same time, we understand and support the goals of this legislation, which is to make sure that individuals who have lost their jobs and are still on UI have some funds to support themselves and their families. I do want to note that by stretching out the period of time over which the department may recover overpayments, it will probably have some impact on the trust fund, although that's a little bit difficult to estimate. In at least some cases where we can't recover through the offsets, we may have to resort to other means, as was noted, and you know, there may just be instances where we're just not able to do that. But again, it's difficult to put an exact dollar number on it. I know that it was noted that there is a conformity opinion from the Federal Department of Labor. We want to double check with that. We'd also have to make sure we could make this work with the various interstate agreements that Maryland is a party to. And finally, I do want to note, as has already been said in other contexts, we still have a lot of systematic issues at the department, issues that need fixing with unemployment insurance. So if, we would ask that the committee, as it considers this legislation, just build in adequate time to make sure that the department could execute any changes in a functional and clear and transparent way to make sure they're really effective. We do have a lot of overpayment issues that are still outstanding and lingering from post-pandemic, and there's a lot of cleanup to be done. It's a top priority of mine to improve our processes to benefit claimants and also better serve employers. Happy to answer any questions.
Delegate Aaron's.
Dean, again, I appreciate you're new and all that stuff, but you just hit on my point a little bit. We do have issues from before. What percentage of those people are still collecting unemployment? Do you have any idea? I mean, I don't mean to put you on the spot. Please don't.
I don't know that it's necessarily that large a percentage. We have a lot of overpayment issues from lingering from the pandemic. And as one of the prior witnesses noted, it is something that happens often through just, we didn't get this information on time. We didn't realize you'd already gone back to work or picked up another job. Like, there can be honest mistakes in the system. We can get back to you on that, but it comes up pretty frequently, but I'm not sure it's always while people are still on UI. But it can come back later if you're unemployed again.
Okay, so I may be off. I may have been overpaid and I'm back to work and then I get laid off again. You're saying this will affect that? That's why?
Yes, exactly.
Okay,
It could.
thank you
There
very much.
is a statute of limitations on overpayments, but that's sort of years out. So, ups and downs, people have seasonal employment. It could happen a second time.
Thank you very much.
Delegate Weibel.
Mr. Chairman, so are you favorable, unfavorable, or not taking a position?
They're just here for information.
We're here for information, but we support the goals and be happy to work with the committee on it.
But it sounds like it creates some challenges for you.
I think it's an implementation issue, but it's not that it can't be done. And as the other witnesses noted, many other states do it. I think we just need some time to make sure we get our house in order. We're already facing a lot of challenges in addressing the overpayment system.
Okay, thank you.
All right, seeing no further questions, Madam Secretary and Andrew, thank you both for coming. That concludes this bill hearing. Next and the final and last bill of the day is House Bill 724, Delegate Charkoudian. Yep.
Enough? Yeah, you can pull up another chair. All right. Mr. Chair, Vice Chair serving as Chair, colleagues, for the record, Delegate Lorig Charkoudian here asking for a favorable report on House Bill 724. So I want to put this in a little bit of context. I think everyone started paying a whole lot more attention to unemployment insurance over the course of the pandemic, if folks hadn't been paying attention before. We've been talking about how unemployment insurance is a really important safety net, and it is, and we have to make sure that the safety net that we have allows people to continue functioning and feeding their families and paying their rent and not ending up in debt as they go through their unemployed period. But the other really important role that unemployment insurance plays, and I think this is a really important piece to keep in mind when we're thinking about the health of the trust fund and the health of the benefit amounts, is that it's a really important countercyclical force in our economy overall. And one of the reasons I think that we did not have the recession that we sort of saw and the economic challenges that we saw during the recession, during the pandemic, were not as devastating to local economies as they could have been. They certainly were devastating, but they weren't as bad as they could have been. It's because there was money flowing through those economies. And a lot of the money that was flowing through those economies was unemployment insurance funds that were supplemented by the federal government during that particular economic downturn. But that's a really important part of this, because when we have a healthy unemployment insurance system, it is beneficial for the individuals, it's beneficial for the economy overall, and it's beneficial for the small businesses that are in that local economy, especially during a recession. So as we came through COVID, lots of questions got asked about unemployment insurance. And for those of you who were here in 2021, you know, we had a lot of bills related to unemployment insurance, and we passed several of those bills. We made some improvements. Some of those improvements are still being worked through, especially with new leadership at the Department of Labor, and I'm grateful for the work that the new secretary and her team are doing on that. But a lot of those bills turned into studies, as we like to do, with bills that are complicated and that we do have legitimate questions around. And so at the beginning of last year, you might recall that we had a whole host of studies that came from Upjohn Institute. And those were presented in depth to the Unemployment Insurance Joint Oversight Committee. And that committee had a chance to look at them in more depth and ask a lot of questions. And they were presented as an overview to the entire Economic Matters Committee. And for those of you who weren't here at the time, I'm happy to share them with you and even to talk through them with you if you're interested in the details of what they provide. But they really laid out for us a number of things. They laid out for us a path that we need to take to really look at the suitability and the affordability of the benefit levels that we have at a lot of different levels. So they laid out for us how our benefit levels compare to surrounding states. They laid out for us how our a number of things like the income disregard or the dependent allowance haven't been increased in decades in some cases. And they really laid out what we need to do to make sure that our benefit amounts are really meeting the needs of people who are unemployed. So that's one set of things that they did. And then the second thing they did is they said, and how could we fund that? What do we need to do to the trust fund in order to appropriately and sufficiently fund the kind of benefits that we need to have in this state? And so they laid out a number of pathways for that. And I took those reports and I spent time over the last summer putting together a package of all of that, which you see in this legislation here. And I followed up with the economists at Upjohn, and I asked them to model this package for us. I said, if we put these 5 or 6 things together in this combination, will that create a sustainable trust fund for the state? What will that do over time in terms of our ability to keep the trust fund solvent, essentially, and what will it do in terms of the trajectory of the trust fund? And I asked for options, and I asked him to model out a couple of different ways that if we bumped this up or bumped that down, what would that do? And I'm sharing that because there are a lot of moving parts, and I'm going to go through the details in a second, but there are a lot of moving parts because when we do the work on the unemployment insurance system, if we push on this piece of it, it has an effect on that part of it. And so we can't do a lot unless we're doing it holistically, and that's what this bill tries to do. So what you'll see, this report is in your testimony, is with the written testimony. And this sort of models the various options and does them in terms of like putting together the multiple changes at one time and projecting what that would look like over time. So I just want you to know that that's there so we can see that. And if we choose to make amendments to this bill, we can see like, okay, if we change this but we don't change that, we can still do the projections of what that would mean for our trust fund. So I think we can have a healthy discussion about what the right thing to do is, but I just want to make sure folks know that we also have the data behind it that helps us know what those long-term impacts are going to be. So having said all that, what does the bill do? What is the package that sort of is solvent and would work for us? So it addresses the maximum and minimum amounts the minimum and the maximum weekly benefit amounts. It ties them to the average weekly wage. The majority of states, rather than having a fixed maximum and minimum, has maximum and minimum that are tied to the average weekly wage. And so what that means is that over time with inflation, the benefit amounts will increase with inflation, and rather than us having to come back together every 10 years and go, whoops, we're way out of line from what happened with inflation, and let's adjust that. It addresses the income disregard. So the income disregard, you might recall, and you might have learned about this during the pandemic, if you're working 2 jobs and you lose one of those jobs, presumably you needed both of those sets of incomes if you were working 2 jobs. You lose one of those jobs, you get almost nothing in unemployment insurance benefits because so much of that income from that second job gets taken out of the check that you get from UI for that first job. And so it actually creates a disincentive to keep that second job. And so balancing that out is both important for incentives for people to keep working, but also for the ability of somebody to be able to continue to feed their families, which is what we're trying to do with this. Third, it affects the dependent allowance, which it increases that. That hasn't been increased since 1988. And then in order to make sure that we have a sufficient trust fund, it increases the taxable wage base. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the taxable wage base, which was set at $8,500 in 1992. If we had adjusted that $8,500 in 1992 to inflation, it would be $18,414 today. So this bill sets the taxable wage base at 25% of the average annual wage. Again, setting it against wages, make sure that it adjusts with inflation over time. That 25% today would be $20,615. So it'd be very close to what it would have been if we had adjusted the $8,500 to inflation. Similarly, bless you, similarly, and we could, it's 25% in the bill. There's, if we set it at 22%, it would be at that inflation amount. We can discuss those pieces. So that's sort of the inputs and outputs to the trust fund, the benefits, and then the income. But I wanted to address one other thing, and that is the effect of tough times on businesses. And as you may know, with unemployment insurance, when a business has laid people off, we have what we call the experience rating. And so their own personal rate of unemployment insurance tax goes up if they've laid more people off. And so what that means is that right after a business has gone through a tough time, they're going to have a higher tax rate, and they're going to have to pay back into the system for 3 years. So one way to dampen that impact is to spread that over 5 years instead of 3 years, so that they're paying less into the system for 5 years instead of more into the system for 3 years. They're still paying it back in, but we're dampening the impact at a time that's difficult for that business. The second thing, so the individual rating for the business is their rate, and then depending on how the economy is doing, that's what table we're in, and that also affects the rates for businesses. So when the economy's doing great and the trust fund's solvent, we're in table A, lowest possible rates for everybody. F is the highest. You might recall last year, those of you who are here, we took some federal money and we put it into the trust fund so we could get it up to C. The other thing that this bill does is it sets it so we don't move between tables any more than 2 tables at a time. So if we're in a recession, we still are going to have to move to a different table. But again, we can dampen the impact on businesses by moving more slowly between those tables so that at a time that the businesses are struggling the most, they're not necessarily paying the highest amount. The last thing in the bill, so all of those things are sort of tools that are used across the country. And I think that the time is right for us to put this into place here in Maryland, obviously in the context of conversations with the committee and the subcommittee and advocates and opponents. The last thing the bill does is a little more creative, and I was working on finding ways to support small businesses, mom and pop businesses, that we've heard from struggle to pay all the different pieces of the puzzle, including sometimes the unemployment insurance taxes. And I want you to think about a couple years back when Toys R Us went bankrupt and laid off several hundred people in the state. And so here's how I want you to think about that. So Toys R Us was bought out by private equity, was highly leveraged, and went bankrupt, and then no longer existed as a company. That's the employer who normally, when they lay off several hundred people, would be responsible for paying back into the trust fund for the several hundred people they laid off. But if Toys R Us doesn't exist anymore, then they're not paying back into the trust fund. So who is paying into that trust fund to pay for the unemployment insurance for those several hundred people? It's the small mom and pop businesses. And so what we know is that when private equity firms buy companies, sometimes it's good for the companies, but if they're highly leveraging those companies, there's a good chance, there's a much higher chance that those companies are going to go bankrupt and they're not going to exist. And if that happens, the rest of the companies in the state that do exist are going to be the ones who are going to pay for that unemployment insurance. So what this bill does is it sets up a system so that when a private equity owned local company is leveraged at 500% or above, which is a pretty high amount to be leveraged, the private equity firm puts a bond up, and if the leverage amount goes down, and so that firm's not in danger of bankruptcy, then they get the bond back. But if that firm goes bankrupt and doesn't exist anymore, that bond is used in the pot to be paying back for the hundreds of people that are now on unemployment insurance, so that our small businesses aren't taking the hit for that. I know that's a lot, but as I said at the beginning, unemployment insurance is one of those things that when we come with bits and pieces, if I just came with one of these pieces, the answer would be you can't change that because that would affect this, and if you just change that, that would affect this. So it has to be a lot to do the whole package and to really update our system. So appreciate your patience. As you know, I'm happy to go into even more detail on any of these pieces if people have questions. But first we'll hear from my panel.
Good afternoon. I'm Donna Edwards. I'm the president of the Maryland State and DC AFL-CIO. So Mr. Chair and acting chairs and all of the committee, thank you. I know that you've had a long hearing. You have our written testimony. There are two very important pieces here for workers, and that is that the maximum and minimum are expanded and are indexed. We have not had an increase since 2010. And indexing is done now by 26 states. So we're not the first, we're not even in the middle. The second thing is definitely the disregard of the second job or third job. Obviously, if you are cobbling together 2 or 3 jobs, you need those jobs for your quality of life. But you lose one of those jobs, and the next thing you know is that you're penalized for having the other 2 if you get unemployment insurance. So that disregard is very important for keeping people's quality of life. When this was discussed in the 1930s, it was discussed not only how to hold families together and help families and workers that were on tough times, but also how to stabilize our economy. And everyone knows year after year, as I've been in this committee, every dime of an unemployment check is spent. It's not invested, it's not sent to the bank to go into an account. It's spent, and it's spent in local economies. So this, I want to thank the sponsor. We all know that it's well-researched, and I thought that a very good delivery of explaining it. And thank you all. I'm asking you for a favorable report on House Bill 724.
Hello, thank you to the chair and committee members. My name is Rico Albuquerque. I'm with IBEW Local 24. We represent over 2,250 workers in the Baltimore metro area. And I just want to highlight the point of view from someone who has received unemployment benefits. I was on unemployment in 2010, and the amount is the same now that it was then, and I think we can all agree that cost of living has went up significantly since then. The legislation, the unemployment law now it's out of date, and those 2,250 members, most of them either have received unemployment benefits at some point in time or will at some point in their career. And so for me and for my members, it's not a thought experiment. It's dollars and cents at the dinner table, people trying to figure out how to save their families, how to save their houses, and it's tough to do it when the unemployment payment is less than minimum wage. So that's all I had to say. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Once again, I'm Lucy Zoe, and I'm an attorney in the Public Justice Center. The Public Justice Center supports HB 724 and wanted to emphasize a few key components of the bill. As you've heard, the bill would improve unemployment benefits in a few ways, including by increasing the maximum and minimum benefit amounts, which have remained the same for more than a decade. The state's average wage replacement rate is currently well below the 50% that experts recommend, making it extremely difficult for unemployed Marylanders to pay for food, rent, and other essentials for themselves and their families while they look for a new job. Increasing the maximum and minimum, as proposed in this bill, would effectively improve Maryland's average wage replacement rate and better ensure that the benefits meet unemployed Marylanders' basic needs. The bill would also increase the dependent allowance, which is a benefit added per dependent on top of regular unemployment benefits. And since 1998, the dependent allowance has only been $8 per dependent. This bill would increase that allowance to 25% of the minimum weekly benefit amount. And this is important because households with children are much more likely to face food and housing insecurity when someone in the household loses a job. Of course, it wouldn't be prudent to propose expanding benefits in all these various ways without also ensuring that the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund can raise enough money to provide those benefits. And so importantly, this bill would change the taxable wage base, which has remained at $8,500 for over 2 decades, and make it 25% of the average weekly wage by 2027. Expanding the taxable wage base would strengthen the financial integrity of the trust fund over the long term. Thank you for your time, and we respectfully request a favorable report. Thank you.
Hi, once again, I'm Cornelia Bright Gordon from Maryland Legal Aid. I will say that I've been practicing unemployment law for about 23 years now, and my clients who find themselves in need of unemployment, they look just like you and I. And they're stunned to find themselves in need of unemployment benefits. They're workers. They've always been workers, and unemployment benefits are only available to people who are employed and lose their job at no fault of their own. Unfortunately, the state is in a position now where responsible governance requires that you, and you've already accepted this responsibility, look at our trust fund and see whether or not it's serviceable to meet our needs for the future. And we all know the answer is no. And so the time has come so that we don't repeat the errors of our past. Maryland Legal Aid asks that this committee favorably report on House Bill 724 without amendments. The unemployment statute's calculation of benefits is antiquated. Its updating is required to ensure that the trust fund remains secure during recessions and that the maximum and minimum weekly benefits reflect current economics. The current statute's taxable wage base has not been updated since 1992. This is ridiculous. Should a family have minor children and need a dependent benefit, the maximum they can get is $40 for 5 children. So HB 724 remediates this dated calculation of benefits, which would be hard put to permit a family to even buy a hamburger meal. So it's time for the statutory scheme to be updated. Thank you for your time.
Delegate Adams.
Thank you, Chair. So, Delegate Charkoudian, the COVID, right? So, I mean, we had alcohol bill yesterday. There was a bill that seemed to want to continue the change in policies that related to being able to distribute, liquor, letting small businesses continue to do that practice. But really, the reason why the committee created it was because we were trying to exist under unprecedented circumstances. And so the fact that we're having the bill here yesterday was sort of a question, well, do you still need it? Is it still required, or do we need to go back to the business as normal? I would like to make the analogy on this piece of legislation because I think I know what unemployment insurance is, and I'm going to ask you the first question, which is I think unemployment insurance is the bridge between someone who has job A and as quickly as they can get into job B, giving them some financial assistance to do so. But I suspect that your bill it would propose that unemployment insurance is something different than that. So I would ask you, what is your definition of unemployment insurance?
Yeah, so as I said at the beginning, I think there's 3 things that unemployment insurance is doing. And I think this is consistent with what the U.S. Department of Labor and probably the Maryland Department of Labor, they can tell you, believe that unemployment insurance is doing. So one is it's the bridge for that person and their family to survive and frankly not to end up in a great deal of debt on the other end of that, right? Not to lose their house in the process. So there's that part of it. The second thing, and all of the economic literature points to this, is to make sure that you have good job matching, because you don't want unemployment insurance benefits to be so low that someone feels desperate and takes the first job that becomes available, because then you have a situation where that's actually very inefficient for the economy, because then you have the training that happens and then that person leaves when they get the better job. So you do want people to have the incentive to look for work. That's an important piece of it, but you also want to make sure that people have the incentive to find right job matching. And so there's a great deal of economic literature that talks about sort of how do you do that maximization problem and get the right amount. And that's where some of these best practice standards across the country about how do you get that right amount, some of that is about how do you create the right incentives for job matching. So that's the second, hang on, I'm going to answer your question. So you asked me, what do I think unemployment insurance does?
That's the question.
That's the second thing it does. And the third thing that it does, and this again is part of what we saw during COVID, but we also saw it in previous recessions, is that it helps communities survive recessions. It keeps small businesses open through recessions. And so that larger countercyclical effect of unemployment insurance is an important piece and a reason, and it is why it's designed to be pumping more money into the economy when the economy is worse because more people are unemployed. Right, so those are the three things I think unemployment insurance.
Okay, so we'll grant, for the sake of the conversation, that my definition is a little bit narrower than your definition, and that's okay. So the second question is, unemployment rate in Maryland, of course, the Secretary is here, might give me better statistics, but it updated the end of last year was at 4%. And my second question is, what is 4% in unemployment insurance's world? Is that high? Is that low? Is Maryland desperate for people to look for and find and actually go to work, or do you think we have a lot of people sitting on the sidelines that have no other options available to them?
Well, I think for the 4% who are unemployed, I think that is high for them. I mean, there's people who are struggling to put food on the table for their families. So whenever we say that's high or low compared to something, we have to acknowledge that there's human beings involved who are suffering and struggling. So I think it's lower than it's been. But if I could just bring us back to this bill, because you're asking about big picture thoughts about unemployment, which are important, but this bill is not about this moment in time, because so many of the things in this bill phase in over the next 4 or 5 years. This bill is about setting up a system that is right for the long term, especially and including the next recession. There will be another recession at some point, and so we want to have all of our systems in place. So it's not about COVID, except that COVID put a spotlight on unemployment, and it gave us a chance to do these studies that told us, whoa, like this does not match what other states are doing. That's what COVID gave us. But this isn't responding specifically to COVID, except that it was an economic downturn, and we need to prepare for future economic downturns. Hopefully none will be as bad as that.
So, okay, my last question is kind of where I was headed when I asked you your first question, is that we're accepting the fact that this bill dramatically changes unemployment insurance. I would argue that it fundamentally reimagines what unemployment insurance is and what it means, and could very well adjust a person's attitude as to whether or not they accept the best and most available job in front of them, and instead grants them extended periods of time to do any number of things. But the last question is this. Is it better that someone find a job than it is to stay on unemployment insurance, notwithstanding it might not be the job that you use the phrase right size or right whatever. I mean, a person should be able to go find available work, and in Maryland, I would argue they can do that, and that if you set up the unemployment insurance differently or more broadly or more liberally than what we have had prior to COVID, because I don't think if COVID ever came around, we would be sitting here talking about this bill. But would we not be saying that this is actually the wrong approach, because it's not speaking to why unemployment insurance exists? It's not meant to be long-term fringe benefit or extended benefits for the purpose of giving people the opportunity to find just that perfect job in that perfect scenario. It's meant to be just a little bit on the side of, we're here to help, and the employers are participating in helping you get from this job. And if you can find that next job in 7 days, then find that job in 7 days, because that's the place to find unemployment. And I would allow you the final say, and isn't that so? But I would, I'm sure you wouldn't go my route.
No, and here's why.
Okay.
And I just want to say that it's not just like, what do I think? I mean, there is like extensive literature about making sure you get this number right. And there's not agreement on making sure you get the number right, but there's extensive economic analysis about this question of how do you set it so that you do efficient job matching for the entire economy. And that literature would suggest that you don't want people so desperate that they take the next job, that that's not good for the businesses, that's not good for the economy, it's just not good. So, because people aren't going to stay in that job, right? So then you just have a lot of turnover and training but anyways, the other part of your question though, is that you're asking about, does this, I think if you just look at the numbers that haven't changed in 10 years and 13 years and 15 years and 20 years and 30 years, and we just updated everything based on inflation, we would actually be much closer to the numbers that are in this bill. The third thing is that there actually is analysis, again, in the study that's here of if you make this change, how much does that increase the amount of time people are likely to stay in unemployment as opposed to taking the very next job. And the analysis of these numbers are potentially it extends by 5 days, how long someone stays. So you're not talking about people then kicking back and going on vacation. And the last thing that's really important is that there's still a job search requirement. So still people have to go and search and demonstrate to the agency that they have searched, they've put in their resume, they did the interviews. So it's not like during COVID there was a period that wasn't required, but going forward that is required. And so you can't just not look for work, right? You're still actively looking for work in order to keep getting the unemployment benefits.
I enjoyed the exchange. Let me just say, since you brought up the work search requirement, our company recently was looking for employment. We had 70 people apply under a program called Indeed. It took me 15 calls before we got to the point where there was actually a qualified person who was doing that platform who showed up for the interview. And my question, and don't need to answer it here today, but the question is the work search requirement rigorous enough where someone says, well, here, I went on Indeed and there's my resume and I had these companies I sent out. They never did the interview. My point is this bill would not exist free of COVID. And Mr. Chairman, I'll leave it there.
Well, okay.
Delegate Weibel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just looking at the title, it's titled Modernization Act of 2023. So just thinking back a little bit under COVID, it was documented that there were actually payments once you added the federal government bonus payments in there. Folks were actually making more on unemployment than what they were making when they were employed, and the numbers were pretty staggering. So does this bill address that if there was a situation that occurred like that again, that your benefits could not exceed what you were making when you were fully employed?
It doesn't. The modernization is that this is tying in, the majority of states have moved towards these indexed pieces, like indexing the benefits maximum and minimum to the average weekly wage, indexing the taxable wage base to the average annual wage. So it's the modernization part of it is we set things in 1992 and we haven't changed anything since then, even while other states have changed how they're doing things. So that's why that's the language I've used. Despite the fact that Delegate Adams is convinced that this is coming out of COVID, except that the studies came out because we went through COVID. This bill is called for even if we had never experienced COVID. This bill is bringing us up to date with the way that states are doing things in 2023, regardless of COVID. And so no, it doesn't actually respond to anything specific that happened during COVID, like the way that the federal benefits affected people's ability.
So you're saying that it updates it to what other states are doing. Do you know what Virginia, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania are doing in that regard?
Well, there's lots of different parts to this, but for example, I have, let's see, where's the index of just as one quick example, the states that set their maximum to the average, index their maximum to the average weekly wage in 2019, you said, what were the ones you asked about?
I was concerned because of where
So
I'm
Virginia,
from, Virginia, West Virginia, Pennsylvania.
Yeah, so Virginia sets their maximum weekly benefit amount to 0.65% of the average weekly wage. So that's like 2/3. That's very similar to what's in this bill. West Virginia doesn't appear to index theirs. There's 26 states that index theirs in 2019. I'm looking at the 2019 numbers. And the average that they indexed them was 0.57%. So that's on, if you have this memo that's in it's in your documents there, this is the page that I'm looking at, and you can see what all the other states do.
Okay, thank you. And then my last question deals with what Delegate Adams touched upon. I experienced the same thing where, you know, we had job openings and you would have 30 people apply and you were lucky to get one to respond. People just wouldn't answer the phone. They wouldn't respond to emails. So I'm assuming they were just checking the box that they were actively searching. Does this bill address at all any way that employers can report that, you know, this person was scheduled for an interview and just never showed up, so that their benefits could be curtailed?
So this bill doesn't address the work search requirements and the implementation of them. I think when the secretary is here or in a separate bill or a separate context, I think they may be able to answer more questions about how work search happens. But this bill doesn't address that. But if you all think there's not enough in this bill, you know, I could try to add more.
I'm sure. Thank you.
Delegate Chi.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just want to commend Delegate Charkoudian for this, taking on this huge effort to modernize and update our system. And I can see my colleague's point about pandemic era emergency measures versus normal quote-unquote time. But I think if the pandemic did anything, the silver lining is we have learned a lot. And it really showed us our failures, sometimes systemic failures, or at least our lack of readiness to address the next pandemic-like crisis, which we cannot guarantee that would never happen. So I appreciate the heavy lift because I think as much as I'm looking forward to listening to the department and also the opposition voices to make sure we're open-minded about how to best address that, we can all agree it needs to be addressed comprehensively, because I heard from both employees as well as employers who were so shocked that they switched overnight from Table A to Table F. So if this bill, one of the measures you proposed, for example, is only a two-step increase at a time, that at least is some measure of predictability that should have been helpful to the businesses. You know, so rather than patchworks of telling people and telling their accountants and the messages getting lost, rather than, you know, fixing it by putting in $1 billion to stabilize the fund, we do need to address it comprehensively. So the question I want to say is, isn't that so?
That
That's
is
it.
so. Thank you, Delegate Chi.
Okay, that concludes this panel. We have one more in person.
You have two other questions.
Who? Sorry. Okay, go ahead. Delegate Fraser-Hidalgo.
Thank you, thank you. Delegate, just very quickly, when we talk about this, what was said earlier is that this bill would not be here if it weren't for a pandemic. Can you review those numbers that you stated very early on as to what the benefits were? I don't remember what year, it was like 1990 something, versus what they would be if they were adjusted for inflation.
Yeah, so I won't go through every single one of them, but.
Just the main, you had
so
two
like
numbers.
I think that was, I was describing, that was the taxable wage base, which was set at $8,500 in 1992. And with inflation, that would be $18,414 today. And this bill sets it at 25% of the average wage base, which would be $20,615. So it's very close to, the what that would be if we had just kept up with inflation.
What does that have to do with the pandemic?
I'm not sure.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, now seeing no questions. That concludes this panel. We have one more in-person favorable, Christopher Meyer, and then we will go to the favorable virtual, and then, Madam Secretary, I'll let you go as information. Mr. Baker in the... Okay. Sir, when you come up, please start.
Thank you, Vice Chair Crosby and members of the committee. My name is Christopher Meyer. I'm a research analyst at the Maryland Center on Economic Policy. We are in favor of House Bill 724 because currently Maryland does far too little to support workers after a job loss. In 2021, standard unemployment benefits in Maryland averaged just $336 a week. That's equivalent to less than $18,000 a year. I recognize there's been some significant inflation in recent years, but even as of 2019, 2018, that's not enough to live on. Based on analysis by the Economic Policy Institute, it would take about $600 a week for even a single worker with no kids to afford a basic living standard as of 2018 in Allegheny County, and $750 in the Baltimore metro region, more than $1,000 a week in the Washington metro region. So benefit levels under the current system were deeply inadequate even before the recession, or even before the pandemic. In fact, even with increased federal benefits, Marylanders who relied on unemployment in 2021 often reported struggling to put food on the table or falling behind on their mortgage or rent. Fixing our UI system is a matter of racial justice. Black workers and Latinx workers always have significantly higher unemployment rates than their white counterparts. So when we think about what the currently unemployment rate is, remember that it is much higher for certain communities. Just quickly, I want to note that a working paper in 2021 from the International Monetary Fund found that every dollar in unemployment benefits generates $1.92 in increased local earnings. And finally, the bulk of high-quality research finds that even during federal expanded benefits with replacement rates over 100%, there's minimal effect on the number of people working. Thank you, and I respectfully ask for a favorable report.
Thank you, sir. Next, we'll go to, I apologize, Delegate Fisher. Nope, sir.
Oh, I apologize.
Trust me, I'm more sorry for you in a second.
I'm
Delegate
so
Fisher.
used to the sponsor panel getting peppered and then everyone else just getting off free.
How are you? So my question is, you said for every dollar of unemployment, but I didn't quite get that statistic. Sincerely,
Right.
I was trying to listen. I couldn't hear it.
No, absolutely. So 2021 working paper from the International Monetary Fund that every dollar in unemployment benefits generates $1.92 in earnings in the local area. And basically the way that that works.
So in other words, if everybody just didn't work, we'd have more economic productivity? Is that what that means?
No. So the way that that works is that when benefits are more adequate, workers then spend that at local businesses, buying groceries, paying their utilities, buying clothes.
So by paying people who don't work more, then they go shop more, and that helps the economy. So that's what your argument is.
Yes, that is what this empirical finding from the International Monetary Fund found.
Okay, thank you. We'll now go to our virtual, which is Jim Baker.
Great. Good afternoon. Chair Wilson, Vice Chair Crosby, members of the committee. My name is Jim Baker with the Private Equity Stakeholder Project. We're a nonprofit watchdog organization focused on the impacts of private equity firms, hedge funds, and similar Wall Street firms on workers and communities. I wish to speak in support of HB 724. Among other things, the legislation would bolster the safety net for workers who are laid off due to insolvency of their workplaces by requiring private equity firms and hedge funds that use large amounts of debt to buy companies to pay their fair share in unemployment insurance. Private equity firms and hedge funds routinely acquire companies using a strategy known as a leveraged buyout. Essentially, these firms buy companies using mostly debt, sometimes as high as 90% of the overall cost of the transaction, and use the acquired company as collateral. Highly leveraged companies run the risk of bankruptcy due to unmanageable debt obligations, leaving nothing for workers after creditors have received payment. A 2019 study by the California State Polytechnic Institute highlighted the connection between leveraged buyouts and higher incidences of bankruptcy, finding that after tracking a sample of private equity acquisitions, firms that were acquired by private equity firms in a leveraged buyout had a 20% bankruptcy rate compared to 2% for firms that were not. The debt-heavy strategy of leveraged buyouts has already led to layoffs for employees all over the country, including in Maryland. For example, private equity-owned Toys R Us and Sears filed for bankruptcy in 2017 and 2018 respectively, leaving shuttered stores and jobless employees in their wake. The bill before you will help protect employees of highly leveraged companies and the unemployment insurance system by ensuring that such private equity firms and hedge funds are held responsible if highly indebted businesses they own go bankrupt or shut down. Thank you for your time, and I urge you to favorably report this bill out of committee.
All right, thank you, sir. Seeing no questions, we're going to go quickly to the Secretary and Andrew Folginiti. So, Secretary Wu, please, you guys are both information only, so please provide your testimony. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm Portia Wu, the Acting Secretary of Department of Labor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Vice Chairman. I wanted to thank Delegate Charkoudian for her leadership and her dedication to unemployment insurance. The department strongly supports the goals of this legislation and agrees that UI is in desperate need of reform. Reform should strike a balance between addressing benefits to make sure there's adequate income replacement for workers and they encourage attachment to work, certainty and fairness for employers and contributions, and making sure the trust fund is solvent. As has been discussed by the other witnesses, we have not kept up with the modern realities. Some noted that Maryland's weekly benefit amount is $335 a week. That makes us 34th in the nation, despite the fact that we are the 7th most expensive state to live in. Others have talked about the taxable wage base. I want to note that UI and Social Security started with the same taxable wage base of $3,000 in the 1930s, and now Social Security is taxed on $140,000 instead of $3,000. So even the indexing, the amount that's suggested in this bill, many other states have gone beyond that. And I want to explain and give an example for why this is an important thing to consider. The current system is incredibly regressive and means lower wage workers are seeing a much higher percentage of their wages taxed than higher wage workers. So a mom and pop pizza shop is paying the same amount of tax into the UI system for each of their part-time employees making $10,000 a year as a software company or an investment bank is paying on someone making $300,000 a year. But when those workers are laid off, the pizza employee only gets $100 in weekly benefits, and the software engineer gets the maximum of $430. If change is not made, it means that smaller businesses in these retail operations with very thin margins are going to continue to bear the brunt of the costs of the system. We also need to give employers greater certainty. Others have covered this, but the volatility that we saw, right, that's very hard on businesses when there are these massive increases or sudden drops. Need to smooth things out. I think this bill suggests some very good ways to do that, but the department's open to working with the committee to other ways to address the issue. And finally, on solvency, Maryland's UI trust fund has not met the recommended minimum solvency standard since 1996. The trust fund is in good shape now because of the infusion of ARPA funds, but frankly, taxes are still set higher for employers now than they were pre-pandemic. We need to build a long-term solvency of the fund so we ensure employers don't feel those terrible shocks when we have, sudden economic occurrences. Finally, I'll say we understand there's a lot of rebuilding that needs to be done at the department, as I noted before, and we look forward to working with the sponsors and the committee on this important legislation.
All right. Thank you so much, Madam Secretary. Delegate Weibel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Could you respond to the question earlier about how the department verifies that folks do complete the job search requirements?
So we have a portal in which the individuals have to certify that they have completed those job search requirements, and there are a number of job search activities that are the designated activities.
So do they list specific businesses that they supposedly went to?
So it would be, I think your question is also, yes, they have to, I believe that's correct. They have to note exactly where they applied. I heard your question about the concern of what if somebody, ghosts an interview and doesn't show up. I think
they don't go to the interview. They
right,
just don't show up. So how does an employer have the ability to say that, so-and-so never showed up for the interview?
They currently do not, and I would note it would be very difficult for the department to do that because people are often applying to many jobs at one time. So it doesn't mean they weren't looking for work.
But the employee can do it, but the employer can't. So I don't understand why it's difficult.
We wouldn't be able to say the employee wasn't looking for work because they may have gone to a different interview. They may have taken a different job.
But how doesn't, so, I'm just confused then. So there doesn't seem to be any accountability. So If an employee says, I went to such and such business and did not, how does the department verify that he did or didn't go, or you just don't?
Right now, we don't have a way to
Yeah,
verify
see,
the
that
activities
Seems
independently.
like that loophole has to be closed at some point. Thank you.
Delegate Howard.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. So you talked a little bit about the mom and pop pizza shop and, you know, let's say the Walmart or whatever. I asked that question a few weeks ago. I'd like some more information about that. And is there, is there scaling in this legislation? I can ask the maker of the bill. But as far as, I guess I should have asked you while you're up there, but is there scaling for that in the bill? And also, too, walk me through this. Where does this money come from for this fund? Where does it come from? Where is it derived from? Is it contributions from the employer and contributions from the worker?
It's contributions from the employer paid based upon the employee's wages.
So it's contributions from the employer.
That's correct.
So go through a couple of those points that you said that this legislation looks at. You said it looks at, you know, making, I don't know, there's 2 or 3 points that you made in there. My point is what I did not hear is keeping the cost low to employers. And I just wanted to add that should be a part of the calculation. And I think that's what we are looking for. We're always told kind of what we're discovering and what we're learning and what we've done and where we're going and how we think. I think, to me, that's sort of what we're looking at moving forward. Yeah, I agree that I think there is something that needs to be done. But at the same time, I think part of that calculation, I just noticed that it was all the worker, the this, the money, the COVID, the inflation, but it wasn't and also too, we need to keep in mind the businesses that are employing these folks. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Delegate Rose.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here today. Just to follow up on Delegate Weibel and Delegate Adams, you know, working in recruiting myself for over 14 years, there really need to be something done about the verification process because I will get flooded with resumes of people that do not qualify. You'll have someone that was working at Home Depot applying for a cybersecurity job or something of that nature. And so, yeah, they're checking a box, but I've never had anyone from the department call to say, did that person actually qualify? Did they actually submit their full resume and cover letter and fill out the application and everything that's involved? And so one of the other ladies mentioned as far as job matching. From the evidence that I've seen of the resumes that come in for the jobs that we post, I don't know where that education is happening, how that assistance is happening, because it's 95% or higher of people who are clearly not qualified for the work, who are simply just sending out resumes. So I don't know if that's something you can look into, if there's some sort of, even if it's a random verification, you know, picking up the phone and calling an employer, if you say, yes, I applied, you know, if they have to submit a certain number that they've applied to, if there's someone that can go in and just say, pick one randomly out of the list, did they apply, do they qualify? And at that point, look to see, did it make sense for this person to apply for the job? So there's no check up on that. And then we're talking about doing this wholesale change. That should certainly be part of the discussion, in my opinion.
We're certainly happy to look into the issue of verification if that's what the legislature directs. I will note it would be very labor intensive and require a lot of thought. I do also want to note that, you know, this legislation, these kinds of changes have been made in many other states, and they often have been made with the support of the business community. And to the prior question from the comment from the delegate, I do think it's very important, and this legislation certainly does address some of the concerns about impacts on businesses and making sure that, you know, increasing the taxable wage base, there are many ways to turn these dials and calibrate them. And a thing that is important is to have greater certainty and less changeability over the business cycle for businesses. I absolutely agree. That's a critical piece as well.
Thank you.
Delegate Walfo.
Thank you, Mr. Am I good? Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Madam Secretary, for being here. A few delegates have brought up this verification process, and while I personally feel that it's a step to the left from where the Modernization Act's intent is supposed to be, I just have two fundamental questions for the department. One, are there any other states that are doing this verification process in terms of the employers actually having a say in the process?
I'm not aware of any, but we can certainly double check and get back to you.
Thank you. And the second thing is, does the department believe that there's a massive amount of folks who are out there? Again, we're talking about unemployed folks who are looking for work actively, but does the department believe that there are folks who are, obviously there is fraud throughout a lot of the unemployment process, but specifically those who, that we need that e-verification process from the employer standpoint?
We haven't seen that level of evidence on this, of that being a concern. I mean, part of it is the unemployment insurance benefits are pretty low, and most people cannot live on that level of benefits, and so people need to get back to work, and they need to get back to work quickly.
Thank you, Madam Secretary.
Okay, seeing no further questions for this panel, I want to thank both of you for coming this afternoon. And now we will turn to the unfavorable. You can all come up together. I have Mike O'Halloran, Andrew Griffin, and Kaylee Locklear.
Good afternoon, Mr. Vice Chair, members of the House Economic Matters Committee. For the record, my name is Mike O'Halloran. I'm here representing NFIB. I'm very appreciative the Vice Chair took the Secretary before me, because honestly, there's a lot of me too for her testimony for us. I think the business community at large would agree that there do need to be certain changes made to the insurance system, and I agree with the sponsor that doing them piecemeal may not be the most appropriate way of going about them. I also agree that as we look at wholesale changes to the UI, I think we also need to look at wholesale changes to how we do some of the verification to make sure that our employers do have a say, so that they are so that the department and we as a community, frankly, are looking after these contributions, because they are so important to help folks bridge the gap between jobs and jobs. There has been a lot of reference to the Upjohn Institute. I communicated with the bill sponsor. We had spoke, I believe it was back in October, about possibly ideas and how they would impact the business community. I was hopeful then, as I still am, that I think this would be a perfect avenue for the Joint Committee on Unemployment Insurance Oversight to have a look at this, because there is a lot in this bill. There's a lot to be done. And that joint committee not only has representatives from the business community, but also the labor community as well. And I think this is tailor-made for that committee to take a look. I think it's also worth pointing out that while, yes, a lot of these recommendations in this bill did come from the Upjohn report, one of those also did include employees contributing into the UI trust fund. So again, there's a lot of information out there, but today, as this bill stands, we do request an unfavorable report. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Andrew Griffin here on behalf of the Maryland Chamber of Commerce in respectful opposition to House Bill 724. I want to me too all the things that my colleague here just said. I do want to highlight one concern. The bill sponsor did bring it up, but from the Chamber's viewpoint, 95% of this bill before you is dealing with the unemployment insurance system, the administration, and how the system works. I think we have some concern over the collateral component, and we discussed this with the bill sponsor. In our view, this takes this bill beyond simply an unemployment insurance bill to an economic competitiveness bill, where we as Maryland would potentially make a policy decision that says, in order for you to invest in Maryland-based companies, you have to put up a bond. Or the flip side of that, for startup companies to go out and seek venture capital that they need, they're at a economic competitiveness disadvantage in that they say, hey, you have to put up a bond to invest in my company here in Maryland. And so I think we're concerned about that. I think that it's certainly something that could be worked out in a much broader discussion. And so with what has been mentioned here, I would just, again, respectfully oppose the bill before you, but certainly look forward to the conversations because a lot of the ideas in here certainly have merit, and I think we need to hash them out. So thank you for your time.
Delegate Charkoudian.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to clarify and make sure that you saw in the bill that it's not any hedge fund or any venture capital. It's a venture capital with the portfolio company having 500% leverage. That's a huge amount of debt. And so the vast majority of when people are seeking venture capital, it is not to have a debt ratio of 500%, which is a very risky place to be. So did you, because the way that you just explained your concern, it sounded like you were saying it would be any venture capital.
We understand that. I think that, to be honest, we're not sure what the impact of that would be, right? What is the percentage of investment in business here in Maryland would that category fall into,
that
or
has
vice
that
versa?
level of debt.
Yeah, and I think that that's, like I said, something could be worked out at this point, the way we look at it. We're just not sure what the total impact would be, so.
Thanks. And then I guess what we may want to look at together when we're looking at that is of those that are in that 500%, like how many of them end up in bankruptcy, which is a very high percentage compared to your average company, which also end up bankrupt sometimes without that level of leverage. But thanks. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, seeing no further questions, this concludes this panel and the bill hearing and the bill hearings for today. So thank you all and see you tomorrow.
Mr. Vice Chair, just for the committee, I do know our colleague from the Retailers Association could not be here. She's in the committee, but she did ask that we say a simple me too.
Okay. All right. Well, now that officially concludes this hearing. Thank you.